Good morning. I'm Haleh Sfandiari, the director of the Middle East program. I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting on MENA Women in the Reformist Process, a retrospective. Today's meeting is a joint meeting between the Wilson Center Middle East program and the Global Women's Leadership Initiative, and it is the final in a series of 4 meetings. These two programs have put together on women since the events of the Arab Spring began in the late 2011. Today's meeting is designed to assess how women have been involved in the reformist process in the region. Both of our co-sponsoring programs have a long history of focusing on gender issues and bringing them to the forefront. In fact, today's event marks the Middle East program's 130th meeting on gender issues since its inception in 1998, and they have produced 23 publications on women in this period. And Van Dusen, you remember when we had our first meeting with a very small group, and I was told that this city doesn't care for gender issues, let alone gender in the Middle East. And now I don't think there is any institution that does not deal with gender. We have also convened 12 workshops in the region focused on women's issues, and the most recent one in partnership with the Global Women Leadership Initiative was in Amman, Jordan. Today's first panel will be chaired by Rangita Da Silva de Alves, who is the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative. And the second panel will be chaired by Carol Murphy, who is a journalist and the former Wilson Center public policy scholar. In the program, it says that the second meeting, or the original program you got, was going to be chaired by me, but since I was on furlough for I think 15 days or 16 days, I panicked, and I got in touch with Carol and said, please, will you help? And she was so gracious and said, of course. So you are in much better hand. We have a very interesting group of speakers this morning, giving us perspectives from the region and, of course, from the United States. And we look forward to a stimulating discussion. You have the bios of our speakers, so I think we chairs will be very brief in introducing our panelists precisely because of that. As I said, the first panel will be chaired by my colleague and good friend, Rangita. She directs the Women Public Service Project at the center, and she's a woman human rights scholar and practitioner with over 20 years of experience working globally in over 25 countries with a vast network of academic institutions, government and non-government entities on women's human rights law, policy making, and institutional reform. The rest you can read in the bios we have distributed, but whenever Rangita and I speak, I mean, I always would like to refer to her as Miss Substance, because she says, well, if we do this is too fluffy. Let's look for a substance in it. So here it is, Miss Substance.
Thank you, Hale, for that very, very kind introduction. And what you omitted to say was that you have been one of my mentors even before my time at the Wilson Center. So thank you for the mentoring. Thank you for the wisdom that you shared with me and the inspiration of your life. I am the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative, which is proud to host a flagship program, the Women in Public Service Project, which was launched by Secretary Hillary Clinton in December of 2011 as a partnership with the Seven Sisters Colleges. And it gives me enormous pleasure to have with us this morning one of the prime architects of the Women in Public Service Project, the former president of Bryn Mawr College, President Jane McAuliffe. And President McAuliffe, I think this is a very appropriate moment for us to celebrate you, celebrate what you helped to found in terms of the Women in Public Service Project, which is to inspire a new generation of women leaders to serve their communities and their countries with the challenge of 50 by 50. 50% of women in all public service, decision-making and leadership positions around the world by at least 2050. And it is because of the women on the ground who are with us this morning, as well as all of you, that we are encouraged and we know that we will meet that goal. So this morning I want to celebrate and honor a special guest, President Jane McAuliffe, with this tribute to you. President McAuliffe, I hope you will be able to come and receive this on behalf of the Women in Public Service Project at a session that appropriately celebrates and reflects on the progress that women have made in the Middle East and North African region. Thank you.
The reason this program is flourishing is because of the extraordinary leadership it has had, both at the Woodrow Wilson Center from Rangita and from Jane Harmon. We're just delighted. Thank you.
Thank you, President. Our founder, Secretary Hillary Clinton, has said, women's empowerment and women's leadership is the unfinished business of the 20th century. And I would like to add to that to say that the Arab Revolution's unfinished business is the business of women's leadership and women's empowerment. And that is what this panel is all about. At an inflection point in the history of the MENA region, today's conversation with experts in the region is both urgent and timely. The transformation is important for several reasons. Historically, women have been excluded from transitional justice processes, and that has resulted in women being ruled out of the rule of law and created a rollback of prior gains. On the other hand, these moments, these pivotal moments of transitional justice provide women a moment of hope and promise and a window of opportunity to address gaps in the laws and to seize the mantle of change to inform reformist processes. Thirdly, constitutions embody the narrative of a nation's future. Constitutional making provides nations and its people an opportunity to renew themselves and remake themselves. And women around the world have seized this moment of constitutional change. In the past 50 years, more than half the world's constitutions have been reformed or drafted. And this opportunity has been seized by women to write gender equality into the legal fabric of their constitutions and their countries' futures. Of the 28 countries that have reached or exceeded 30% women's representative or women's representation in national parliaments, at least 25 countries have used some kind of quota systems. And 7 of those countries that have exceeded the 30% mark have recently come out of conflict, demonstrating that progress can be made post-conflict and out of conflict. Finally, this is an important moment in the history of the world, especially for the women of the MENA region to inform and shape some of the global reformist processes that are fomenting and help to shape the post-2015 development agenda. A transformative, standalone goal on achieving gender equality is the clarion call at the United Nations, at the UN Women, and by the global women's movement. And the three cornerstones of that transformative standard-setting goal consist of 1, freedom from violence against women and girls, 2, gender equality in the distribution of capabilities, which includes health, education, equal work, and access to land, and thirdly, and most importantly, for us at the Women in Public Service Project, gender equality in decision-making, in power, in politics, and in private and family institutions. Constitutional making is the supreme lawmaking initiative, and it is important to get this moment right. Women cannot afford to lose this moment in time. When we look at some of the important standard-setting benchmarks and blueprints that can inform constitutional making around the world, we know that the human rights standards, especially the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, are imperative standards. And in the MENA region, except for Iran and Sudan, all of the countries have ratified the CEDAW. And Article 7 of the CEDAW calls for greater representation of women in public life and the inclusion of temporary special measures. Security Council Resolution 1325 also calls for increased representation of women at all decision-making levels. And we have to make sure that these standards are translated into constitutional making and to national lawmaking. A very brief panoramic overview of some of the pivotal reformist initiatives in the region. What we see is that the Arab Spring has been a lightning rod for some important reform initiatives on behalf of women, but it's not enough. We know that in Morocco, constitutional reform has called for the supremacy of international conventions and calls for national laws to be aligned to international conventions. And Article 30 of the Moroccan Constitution also requires equal access of women and men to elected office. Tunisia has taken the lead in lifting the reservations to the CEDAW, but unfortunately nothing has been done to actualize the lifting of those reservations. However, what we see is that early mobilizing and mobilizing of women and women's groups is important. And because of that mobilizing in Tunisia, Tunisia has managed to avoid the Sharia being enshrined as the source of law in the Tunisian constitution. And when Miriam Auka and I were in Tunisia working with the women's minister, Shaheen Badi, what we saw was that because of women's leadership, the leadership of women's groups, women assailed the clause of the third draft of the Tunisian constitution, which called for the application of human rights conventions only insofar as they do not undermine religious and cultural norms. And because women were the watchdogs, were the gatekeepers of human rights conventions and constitutional drafting, was that were the women able to avoid that inclusion into the constitution. We also see in Lebanon that there is reform in the area of nationality law, and that because of women's mobilizing, there is some effort to make sure that women who marry foreigners, although they are still not able to pass on their nationality to children, that their children would have access to some of the benefits available to men who marry foreign women. So these children, although they will not be able to inherit the nationality of their mothers, there is a law before Parliament which allows these children to access education, healthcare, and public service jobs. So we see that the Arab revolutions have created a foment of interest in reformist initiatives on behalf of women. But on the other hand, we also see that the rule of law is ruling women out. We see in Egypt women, how they were subject to virginity testing and electric shocks by law enforcement, by those who are the sacred guardians of the rule of law. Women were denied access to justice, which has resulted, however, in women mobilizing and developing the Harass Map, a software program to address sexual harassment in public spaces. So what we see is that unless the rule of law, constitutional making, and the reformist processes are spearheaded by both men and women, that reforms will be incomplete. The promise of the Arab Revolution will never be realized. We see, even in a country such as Saudi Arabia, there's a beacon of hope for women. A new draft law criminalizes domestic violence. Although no implementing provisions have yet been drafted, the law alone is a statement of a standard-setting principle that women have been calling for. So today, I would like our experts, both on the ground and here in the US, to validate some of those reforms and look at the way forward for women in the MENA region. Farah Ispahani, Farah, you embody the quintessential values of the Women in Public Service Project. And I'm thrilled to welcome you back to the Women in Public Service Project at an event that is co-sponsored by the Middle East program. As a distinguished member of parliament and in your capacity as the human rights advisor to President Zardari, you helped to draft and pass the Acid Control and Burn Crime Prevention Bill in Pakistan. Under your watch, during your tenure, a bill to make education free and compulsory for children aged between 5 and 16 was tabled. And the bill also provides for a 10% reserved seats for poor children, and lawbreakers face a fine up to 50,000 or 6 months jail. For the first time in the world, a law on education criminalizes the breach of the law. And this is an important and pivotal moment. So what I would like is to ask you, Farah, to speak about some of the larger political movements, both in the MENA region as well as in the South Asian region, and look at the ways in which the cross-fertilization, the cross-pollination of those ideas can mutually reinforce the reformist agendas, both in the MENA region as well as in the South Asian region, and look at ways on which they can inform and provoke advances in women's leadership around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Talk to you. I think it's easier to go.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming out bright and early on a chilly morning. I'm going to, since this was called MENA Women in the Reformist Process, a retrospective, I want to take a moment to remember women in the MENA region, pre-Arab Spring, Arab Awakening, who fought for their rights and were out there for movements of democracy. I think we should take a minute to remember what their sacrifices were and how they were forgotten the moment that moment moved on. So I'd like to pay my respect to them. The MENA region, as all of you know, has one of the lowest rates of women's political participation in the world. Less than 6% of seats in the national parliaments in the MENA region are allocated or won by women. The urge for democracy and the issue for women's rights is not new to this region. The Arab Spring may have brought democratic forces and the issues of women's political and legal rights once again to the fore, but the region has had indigenous movements for democracy and women's rights for decades. Levels of women's participation and their legal rights have varied from country to country. often religion has been invoked to deny full and equal rights to women. In some cases, women's ability to participate in political life or to have legal rights equal to men has varied within a country based on social status or class. Women from elite social groups have fared better than those from the poorer segments of society. Recent activism continues a long history of women's organizing in MENA. During the first half of the 20th century, powerful women's organizations emerged in the Arab Republic of Egypt and developed close ties with women's organizations and activists in Lebanon, Palestine, and the Syrian Arab Republic. Women's organizations participated actively in the anti-colonial struggles in the 1940s and 1950s in Algeria and Egypt, among other countries. For more perspective, I would like to run these down because history for women is very important. Women in MENA must not feel today that they are waging a fight. No, their mothers and their grandmothers set the standard. In the 1919 Egyptian revolt against the British occupation, men and women were both in the street protests. It was the first time in modern Egypt's history that women were seen on the streets participating in a political struggle. In 1960, during the Algerian Revolution, the National Liberation Front, FLN, had a large number of women supporters who played roles from combatants to fundraisers. While women obtained some rights at the end of the revolt, their position in society did not improve dramatically. 1979, the Iranian Revolution. Women had obtained a number of rights under the Shah of Iran before the revolution. Most of these rights were lost after the 1979 revolution. Here I would like to appreciate Dr. Hale Esfandiari, who was at the forefront of the movement in Iran for women at that critical time. And they made historic changes, which are still for women, young women in Iran, still a beacon of light. So what went before for women is still today relevant. Women in Iran have had to contend with compulsory hijab after the revolution. They couldn't be judges. They lost rights tied to custody and guardianship of children, and women couldn't be diplomats any longer. 1987, the first Palestinian Intifada. Women participated at all levels in this uprising, from organizing demonstrations to hurling stones to distributing leaflets. The Arab awakening also saw high levels of women's participation. It varied, however, from country to country. The dilution of democracy since the early protests, for example, in Egypt, has reduced space for women's participation in the political process. Might be relevant to remember that just because a revolt or revolution succeeds, those who participated in it are not always propelled to power. Rather, a select few obtain power and the rest are often left in the same place as before the event. Societies also take decades to transform, and so any social changes which may occur temporarily during a revolt are not always incorporated into mainstream society. Instead, the society may actually go back to the way things were after the revolution, and for women, this has been classic, leaving women in the lurch. So basically, these temporary granting of rights to women have often been superficial and symbolic and didn't reflect any deep-down change in societal attitude. So today I'm going to talk about two things which are very crucial, and I have seen, coming also from a Muslim majority country in Pakistan, what the two things are which are absolutely crucial. Number one, you have to change the mindset of society. Until you change the mindset of society, which is number one, curriculum change. If you read about gender biases in books all across the Muslim world, women as agricultural laborers, as housewives, perhaps as nurses, etc. Where are the women heroes? Part of my Wilson project, I'm studying religious minorities in Muslim countries, and it is the same thing. Where are they? Where are those role models? So from a very young age, children learn not to look at women except as helpmates. And so that is where curriculum reform is where I believe the West has to really work on. The World Bank and everybody in Washington loves talking about how in the MENA region, oh my God, education levels have gone way up. But what are those big books based on? So take a moment and look at what is great that they're reading and writing from those books, but what's in those books? Those books are full of hate, those books are full of sexism, those books are full of slanders and slurs against non-Muslim religious minorities. So number one, I would say gender reform and other reforms of that kind in the textbooks. So curriculum reform. The second thing that I have seen from my example of my term and my time in the Pakistani parliament and as advisor to the president of Pakistan, laws do make a difference. We managed to pass over 5, and perhaps actually 7 if we're looking at education, laws for women in one parliamentary period from 2008 to 2012. That in the 50 years before in Pakistan's history, that number of bills for women had never been passed or achieved. So for those who are naysayers, who say, oh, these laws are just on paper, let me tell you, I've been through this. Until there are laws on paper, where do women go to even have the right to go to a court, to go to a police station, to go to their member of parliament? Without laws, you have nothing. And what we as a majority Muslim country faced over and over again, whether it's been with dictators and with religious zealots, the moment they come in, they overturn these laws and they bring in laws which are very negative for women and religious minorities. So laws are crucial, but the two things that I totally believe in, you have to change the mindset. Until you change the mindset through education, number one, and a mass media program, number two, I would say education is your long-term goal. And a mass media program, which is your short to medium-term goal. That is where policymakers in Washington and the West have got to focus. That is the reality on the ground in our societies. And I will just, I'm just going to read to you a couple of the bills that were passed, but before that, in most parts of the Muslim world, authoritarian forces have tended to tie up with the religiously conservative ones. We see it in Saudi Arabia, and we see it in many, many other countries also, and depend on them for support and legitimacy. Women's rights and women's issues are often the area where both these forces come together for their own reasons. So appeasement of religious fundamental forces often comes at the expense of women's rights. I'm going to give you some idea of how a government and women lawmakers, because the numbers are staggering. In Pakistan, until election law changes in 2002, women made up only 2.3% of the parliament. And Pakistan was ranked 105th among countries worldwide for female representation. Major change came with an increase in the reserved seats for women, and the elections in 2008, in which all the country's major political parties participated, and the reforms were brought and women's reserved seats were brought in, the number went up to 22.5 of women in the parliament. So anyone who says that these seats are unimportant, no way. You know what? It gave me a seat at the table instead of standing out there in the corridor. That seat at the table, there were many religious males in that parliament who did not want to pass these women's laws because it said they were anti-Sharia. We found ways around. That's what politics is. You find ways around those people. We put together a women's caucus in which women from every political party, whether they were from the Jamaat-e-Islami, from the extreme right, to the liberal progressive parties like the Awami National Party and the Pakistan People's Party. But we found a way when we got those bills written with consensus. Women from different political parties who were laying these bills did not mind bringing them into the caucus and having others look at them. So there were bills agreed on by all. So at the end of the day, I feel very, very strongly that these are the only crucial ways, mindset and laws. And without these, I can't see a way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If there's one message that we can take back from this conference, it is what Farhanaz just said: laws make a difference. Without laws, women cannot vindicate a right, women cannot claim a right, women are denied access to justice. Laws are also constitutive and normative. Laws can propel social change, and laws can advance social change for women. The second message that I would like you to take back is another one of Farah's clarion calls to action. Women must have a seat at the table. And I'd like to quote from you Graça Machel, the wife of Nelson Mandela, who said, "Women must be given a seat at the table. Women cannot be relegated to shouting from the windows because they are not allowed through the door." So seat at the table is imperative. And with that, I would like to invite a very distinguished and preeminent author and analyst of the Middle East and North African region, Isabel Coleman, to discuss constitutional making through the prisms of the Tunisian and Egyptian case studies. As we know, at this moment in time, at this moment in history in the MENA region, there is nothing as important as constitutional making. And what we see is that the global community is focused not just only on the substance of constitutional making, but on what is now called a process-driven constitutional making, which is women and men and minorities being at the table, bringing a plurality of voices, a diversity of perspectives to constitutional making. And I know that Isabel's analysis of Egypt and Tunisia will have deep relevance in Libya, where, as you know, at this moment in time, women and men are drafting a new constitution. Just on the 23rd of September, Libya's High National Election Commission announced the registration for candidates for the Constituent Assembly to draft Libya's new constitution. So this analysis has ripple impact and will have ways to inform and shape constitutions in Libya and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Rangita. And thank you, Farnaz, because I think it's a great segue into what I'm going to talk about. You said many things that really resonate with my comments. I happened to be in Egypt when the revolution started, and it was incredibly exciting, but also slightly terrifying. I never felt unsafe. It was just a time of tremendous turmoil. And I kept thinking, we've seen this playbook before. We have seen secular authoritarian regimes overthrown, And it doesn't always end up in the place where you think it's going to. And within 2 weeks of Mubarak falling, I wrote a piece that was in the Washington Post, and they titled it, of course, not me. They give names to op-eds, and this one that they titled, based on what I'd written, is "Are the Mideast Revolutions Bad for Women?" And it was a warning, because we have seen this playbook before. We've seen it in Iran, as Farnaz mentioned. We've seen it in Iraq. We've seen secular authoritarian regimes overthrown, and an empowerment of an Islamist majority that comes into their power and then dictates changes for women. And based on a conservative reading of Islam, introduces new laws and regulations that roll back many rights that had been achieved by women under the previous regimes. And the early signs of the revolutions across the region were not great, frankly. You had warnings immediately. In Libya, immediately after the overthrow of Gaddafi, the very first thing that the interim government did is they announced that, yes, Gaddafi's overthrown, and we're going to have a new system, and by the way, we're going to bring back polygamy. And they're all firing their guns in the air, and the camera flashed to some of the women in the audience, thinking, really? Is that what we just fought for? We're going to bring back polygamy? In Egypt, you had women. I was there. I saw men and women together in Tahrir Square. And just a few weeks later, on International Women's Day, you had women organize a march, and it turned ugly so quickly, with men out there demanding them to step down, saying that a call for women's rights, not now, it's not the time, you're going against Islam, against Sharia. I mean, these were the things, and much worse, that were said against the women. And you saw in Tunisia stirrings of conservative forces talking about rolling back some of the rights for women. And so immediately the concerns that I had raised in this piece, you could see them playing out on the ground. And I think that it is a real challenge. Transitions are times of opportunity, but they also are moments of peril for women. And we've seen throughout history how women are used as street fodder, to come out. I mean, nobody did this better than Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini got the women in the streets. It was one of the main impetuses for really making the revolution as widespread as it was in Iran, get the women in the streets, empower them in a way that they'd not been empowered. But then afterwards, back to the sidelines. And, I could see the potential for this across the region. No one, I think, thought this was going to be easy. But one thing that I think is very clear, and again, this is something that Farnaz mentioned, is that women's rights are a marker for a whole set of human rights. And regimes that protect women's rights, governments that protect women's rights, are much more likely to come out in the right place on minority rights, on other freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of the things that go together that inherently make for democracy. And so for me, women's rights are the ultimate canary in the coal mine. If you come out on that in a good place, you're much more likely to trend in a positive direction. Whereas if you don't, then I think everything is at risk. So for me, it's a real key marker. So I want to just spend a few minutes talking about Tunisia and Egypt, which I think are started in very different places, and not surprisingly have ended up today in very different places. In Tunisia is a country where women had achieved more rights in that country than any other MENA country, and had achieved a level of integration in the public sphere beyond any other country in the region too. And not just through political quotas, and not just through top-down laws, but also I think in that mindset that you're talking about, Farnaz. Women in Tunisia have the highest workforce participation. They're a very key element of the economy in Tunisia. They had enjoyed many laws protecting their rights in the family, their legal rights. Women, of course, in Tunisia have access to reproductive health in a way that preceded those rights in many Western countries. And not surprisingly, their fertility rate came down faster in Tunisia than any other MENA country, and in fact is well below replacement level today. And the population in Tunisia it's not a rapidly growing population as some of the other MENA countries are. Women are hugely important as an element of the workforce. So they have enormous economic influence. And immediately there was concern and rumors flying. I was in Tunisia, everyone saying, nada, they're coming back. Ghanouchi, they're going to roll back this, they're going to roll back that. I heard that they're going to make women wear the hijab. They're going to get rid of our right to this, we're going to get rid of our right to that. And what you saw is Ghanouchi, the leader of the Nada party, and other Nada leaders, I think smartly recognizing that women's rights were a litmus test for them. And you saw them quickly making assertion after assertion. Not all Tunisians believe them, but asserting, look, we're not going to roll back women's rights. We get it. This is a marker. We're not going to try to change that. You did see a number of things slip in, and you mentioned some of them already. There was another attempt at one point to introduce a clause that women would be complementary to men. But women were very vigilant in the writing of the Constitution. They were very vigilant as a force, as a watchdog, in effect, for understanding the direction that the whole process was trending in. And I would also add that women were very present. They were in the Constitutional Writing Committee. They were in Parliament. Tunisia used a zipper list that resulted in women in Tunisia getting around 25% of the seats in Parliament, which, to Farah's point, they had a seat at the table. Now, that zipper list, that quota, that reserve system that they used from a party perspective, of course, is allocated along party lines. So most of the women in the Parliament were Nada members. They are part of Nada, but they had quite a moderate perspective and a very strong, given that it started at the top with Ghanouchi saying we respect women's rights, there wasn't this real push to move in a conservative direction on women's rights. And in fact, Tunisia is the only country that has come out with a new constitution thus far that does not include Sharia. And that, again, was something that was very, very important to women and to secular groups broadly in Tunisia. Quotas, I think, are not a panacea. They do bring more women to the table, but we have seen quotas used in Iraq, for example, and they are used along party lines. And so if you have conservative party members who are elected, they toe a conservative party line, women included. I remember being here in Washington meeting with a group of Iraqi politicians. They were secular politicians who had been brought to the United States to meet with people on the Hill and meet with other experts. And I said to them, how are you going to deal with, this is back in 2005, how are you going to deal with Sharia in your constitution? And they said, oh, we'll never allow Sharia in our constitution. We will never allow that. And I said, but I have a draft of your constitution here on my desk, and it's got Sharia all in it. Article 3 right here has Sharia. And they said, we'll never allow that. And I thought, well, then you better get back to Baghdad and start working on this, because here it is, front and center. And of course, there is Sharia in the constitution in Iraq. And, I think the women who were in the Iraqi parliament, many of them were elected from conservative religious parties, and they were proponents of including Sharia. So I take your point, Farah, that having reserved seats gives women a seat at the table, absolutely. But it's not a silver bullet, because it can be manipulated. And you've seen Jamaati women in Pakistan take very conservative views. How you do that, and whether you do it on just party lines, I think becomes very important. But just to wrap up on Tunisia, women started from a position of strength. They were mobilized, they were organized, and they have been very vigilant, and they've played a real watchdog role and made sure that the pitfalls of other constitutions have, for the most part, been avoided in Tunisia. It's not been perfect by any means. In Egypt, you've seen women start from a very different position. And women's rights in Egypt have been a very controversial subject for a long time, and not just from conservative religious elements, but you had, right in the aftermath of the revolution, you had so-called liberals really trashing the women's rights agenda from a perspective of a lack of credibility, that the whole women's agenda was somehow tainted by the fact that it had been so closely associated with the Mubarak regime, with Suzanne Mubarak. And you really saw both from the right and the left people saying, yeah, we'll get rid of that family law that they referred to derisively as Suzanne's laws. So Egypt took a very different direction. I think you did not have the same cohesive nature of a women's movement in that country. You had more divisions, and it resulted there was no quota used for women. Women ended up with less than 2% of the seats in the parliament, and those women who were elected, the majority of them were from the Muslim Brotherhood. They were not going to be strong voices for women, and the Morsi government appointed very few women, just 2 women in cabinet positions and 5 women in the Constitutional Drafting Committee, and they walked out as it became clear that the process was going to not be an inclusive process. We know that there have been enormous shocking incidents of sexual violence and against women in Egypt, but from my perspective, I've seen also a remarkable display of fortitude among women and women's groups, and men, by the way. This is not just women, it's men too, to push back on the conservative narrative, to push back on the attempts to sideline women by keeping women's issues in the forefront, a lot of civil society action, creating new organizations to counter sexual violence and to really bring those issues to the forefront. We know now that there's a new government in Egypt. I have not been a fan of the way that this all unfolded, but there is a new process of writing a constitution, and already you've seen women, I think, regroup and getting a second shot at this new process that's going on. You have seen a new quota for women at the municipal level of government in Egypt, and women are pushing for a quota at the parliamentary level. And in this case, I do think that having a quota in Egypt would be very positive for women, because I think they will not have a seat at the table without it, and it would be a very good thing for them, particularly if it can be engineered in such a way that it doesn't just result in very conservative along party lines. But now I think that there's an opportunity for that to happen. So the net here is that in Tunisia, women started from a stronger point, and they've had more success in securing the gains that they'd already had. In Egypt, it's a much more tenuous situation, and I think it remains to be seen how it plays out in this new continued turmoil that's going on in the country. But I would not rule out Egyptian civil society and women's groups, because they are very strong and gaining strength. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel, for so brilliantly juxtaposing the 2 case studies of Tunisia and Egypt. Quotas may not be a panacea, but they're definitely a catalyst in change-resistant communities. And we've seen that in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in India, where 1 million women have come forward in local government in the panchayat level because of a constitutional amendment which called for a quota of 33% in local government. And the 33% is the critical mass that the United Nations and the global community have validated as being necessary for the voice of women to be heard. Miriam Auka is a much admired friend and colleague whose career as a corporate lawyer in Lebanon really spans both the private sector and the political arena. And she shows the importance of women in business playing a critical role in nation building and the rule of law. And Miriam will speak on the introduction of quotas in Lebanon, building on what both Faranaz and Isabel have commented on. But she will also speak to some of the important reformist initiatives in the penal code in Lebanon. Now, as we all know, and has been historically affirmed, often the civil code reform and the family law reform is considered the litmus test of women's rights. But penal code reform has crucial significance in the realization of women's human rights and in gender equality, and plays a major role in women's lives. And exactly 2 years ago in Lebanon, Lebanon repealed Article 562 of the Criminal Code that mitigated sentences for so-called honor crimes. And that was really an important moment to propel further reform in the penal code in Lebanon, and has really started a movement to examine penal codes and criminal laws in other countries in the MENA region. When both Miriam and I were in Tunisia working with the Women's Ministry, one of the important areas that had been identified by the Women's Ministry was the repeal of the provision in the criminal code that allowed for rapists to marry their survivors of rape as a way of cleansing the crime. And the women's movement had really, in one voice, identified that particular area as the most egregious crime, as the most important area for law reform. And that hopefully will have ripple effects in other countries in the MENA region that embody that same provision in their penal code. So we hope that Tunisia's law reform efforts will have impact in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Iraq, and in Iran, which still have that embodied in their penal code. Thank you, Miriam.
Good morning. First of all, thank you, Rangita, and thank you, Hala, for hosting us and for this wonderful event. I would start by saying that the Lebanese constitution provides for equal rights and obligation and equal rights to access public office. However, women face discrimination in practice and in many legal provisions. Recently, we amended the discriminatory tax laws. Sustained efforts of various activists and civil society were able to amend tax laws that were discriminating. Now, as a result, women benefit of the same tax deduction as men in the same situations. Many projects of law are being discussed still in order to amend discriminatory provisions and institute protective measures. I would like today to address the criminal law and the adoption of a project of law protecting women from domestic violence, and the incorporation of a gender quota provision to promote women access to decision-making position. The first due to its emergency. The second because we are coming to parliamentary elections and our electoral law is in the process of being amended. First, our criminal law and project on the protection against domestic violence. Our current penal law contains many discriminatory clauses. First, it tolerates crimes of honor despite the amendment. Well, previously crimes of honor were not considered as crimes, and the aggressors were released. However, under the pressure of civil society and women organizations, the text was amended, and such acts are now considered as crimes with attenuated sentences. So the situation is better, but still needs to be improved. Second, incrimination provisions on adultery differ between men and women. There are no specific protection also in the penal law against domestic violence. Rangita talked about rape. Actually, kidnapping and rape are suspended if the aggressor agrees to marry the victim. Also, marital rape is not considered a crime. To address these discriminatory provisions, civil society submitted to Lebanese parliamentary subcommittee a project of law protecting women from domestic violence. The project is to be discussed in the subcommittee prior to be submitted to parliament. However, the amendment made in the subcommittee are stripping the text from the fundamental protections. One of the main points of conflict is whether to outlaw marital rape. Another point of contention is whether the personal status law governing family relations and specific to each religious community in Lebanon should override the law on domestic violence. Another point also of contention is whether the religious courts, rather than civil or criminal courts, should have jurisdiction to look into complaints regarding domestic violence. The project is still under discussion in the subcommittee. The main challenges and impediment to the project are the patriarchal society, archaic mentality, as well as religious opposition. Now, concerning women access to parliament by incorporating a gender quota. Many Lebanese women have attained the high level of education. Also, Lebanese women are actively participate in the political process. 50% of voters in each elections are women. However, the number of women who can reach decision-making position is extremely low. And the rate of parliamentary seats acquired by women in the last parliamentary elections was reduced actually from 6 to 4 out of 128 seats. So I believe that in the Arab world we are one of the worst countries. In order to address this extremely low number of elected women, the introduction of a gender quota, although controversial, seems to be necessary because gender quota are the fastest and most effective way to increase women's participation. Currently, a project of new electoral law is to be enacted prior to our next parliamentary election, and it's under discussion. This is a great opportunity for the incorporation of the quota. Women activists are voicing requests to that effect. We are asking for a 30%. We are being faced with counter offer varying from no answer to our request to a 10% to a 20%. But how serious this is, I don't know. The main challenges and impediments to the projects on the incorporation of gender quota are first that the incumbent legislators, who are the one who are going to enact the law, are not agreeing on the provisions on the new electoral law. Consequently, adopting a gender quota provision is not among their priorities, which is to succeed in adopting a text that would guarantee their own seats in the following elections. Also, the Lebanese electoral system already provides for an electoral quota for religious communities. So it's being difficult to find the provisions to be able to incorporate a different kind of quota. There is also 2 initiatives to promote women access to parliament that I would like to cite now. There is an organization that has been recently formed in Lebanon to address these new coming elections with the object to empower women candidates for elections by conducting training programs, by arranging for media coverage, by publishing a directory including the names of all women candidates with a short bio. This way they thought they would cover for the media gap in doing such coverage, and that could give voices to these women. The other initiative is that a women party is being formed. I don't know how this would be efficient because, I mean, all political parties have men and women. So men are helping women and women are helping men in their political programs. In this situation, they figured that forming a women party, including women from different political parties, as well as women independent, could be like an engine in order to provide each other support in the different regions. This could be a very good initiative that could lead to some results. Now the challenges faced for that we are facing also, actually women activists and various organizations are actively following up on gradually reforming all discriminatory texts and adopting protective measures. Also, the Beirut Bar Association signed a protocol of cooperation with a government organization that was formed as a result of the CEDAW in order to implement the CEDAW and to help lifting all the reservation on the CEDAW. So the Bar Association is working in cooperation now with this organization in order to follow up on all discriminatory laws and to implement the CEDAW Convention. However, the challenges to the reforms are again the tradition and patriarchal society and archaic religious interpretation, as well as the discriminatory text. Now, it's noteworthy that waiting for a change in mentality is not efficient because changes are needed in a shorter term. So, and changing discriminatory law is faster. We must keep in mind that amending a text to guarantee equality has the same procedure than amending it again to reinstitute discrimination. Consequently, to prevent rollbacks, we should prevent access of non-supporters to our issues to decision-making positions. Through the democratic process, by being involved in every step of the democratic process as voters and candidates, by monitoring the candidates to decision-making positions, without being fooled by electoral promises, campaign promises, but rather by looking into the history and disclosed as well as undisclosed political purposes prior to voting or prior to supporting a candidate. In the Middle East, the political instability and lack of accountability makes it difficult to address discriminatory laws as to women's issue and to implement the changes. Nevertheless, we should not allow putting women's issues on hold. There are alternative measures as to the action by the parliament. And I would like to talk about this now because in Lebanon we have, you had a shutdown, I mean, for 2 weeks, and it was a huge catastrophe for you. Our parliament, the mandate of our parliament ended 6 months ago. They renewed to themselves. And we have no government for the past 6 months. So we have no shutdown. They say they are still there and on duty, but of course we can't expect any laws to be amended. So what can we do? Actually, alternative measures are in place, and they are some collective initiatives from organizations, public servants, as well as religious authorities, and some individual initiatives that led to some results. And I would like to talk about this now. First, for instance, I didn't talk about discriminating labor law because I don't have time to address all discriminating laws here. But we do have discriminating laws and in the labor field. So what's happening that the judicial authorities looking into labor cases. Are you trying to tell me something? Oh, okay, I'm going to try to be, to wrap up. So the judicial authority are applying the ILO covenants to labor cases when involving women instead of applying the discriminatory law texts. Also, since religious authorities are the one that are most opposing the amendment of the text, it has been some religious authority are now doing some activities. For instance, there is a religious leader who decided to do within his community to assemble women leaders and do a group to lobby for the amendment of the text in their religious community. This group will include men as well as women in this religious community in order to do this. Also, there is the individual initiative of some judges. The first one, there was a decision awarding citizenship to the children of a Lebanese woman. The decision was overruled in appeal because it was against an express text forbidding it. However, the decision was used to change the procedure in acquiring the work permits and residency permits for the children of Lebanese women. So this has been, it has been made easier, although the text was not changed. Also concerning civil marriages, which are not allowed in Lebanon, to 2 points. So this decision, there is a couple who decided they contracted a civil marriage by contract in Lebanon. They based their and requested its registration on the personal status registers in Lebanon. It was opposed first because it was against our law, but they based on an old text from the French mandate before our independence, which said that Lebanese citizens are free in their religions. They are allowed to have a religion or not to have a religion. So they based on this text to say, well, we don't, we consider ourselves as not having a religion, therefore we want to register the civil marriage. Of course, they needed the support of the Ministry of Interior, who issued a decision allowing them to register their civil marriage. Also concerning domestic violence, a man decided to throw his wife and his 2 young daughters out of the family house because he wanted to remarry. So he sold the house to a third party. The wife intended a court action. The decision was rendered by the judge, saying that the right to a family house overrides the right of property. Consequently, the house cannot be sold or transferred to the buyer before the husband provides a similar family house for his family. So I'm sorry, I have to interrupt to stop. Thank you very much for listening.
Listening to Miriam speak, I was reminded of Shirin Ebadi's prescient words when she was watching the revolutions unfold. She said women were at the forefront of the revolution, but women's rights were in the background of the revolution. You know, they were not articulated at the very beginning. And what Miriam is doing through her mobilizing of the women lawyers in the Bar Association is to really bring women's rights issues to the forefront. She was too modest to mention that she spearheaded the work on revising and reviewing the tax code in Lebanon to make sure that the gender-biased provisions of the tax code, which allowed men a tax break when they could prove that they were taking care of women dependents. But that same provision, that same right and privilege was not available to women who were taking care of male dependents and husbands who were dependents. So provisions such as the tax law, which you think may not have the same implications and impact on women's lives, have an enormous impact. And the ways in which women lawyers can play a major role, even women in corporate law can play a role in advancing women's rights is just so fascinating. Thank you, Miriam. And finally, I'm delighted and so proud to introduce to you Sausan Sahar. Sausan is one of our own. She is a graduate of the inaugural Women in Public Service Project Institute at Wellesley College. And we are honored to welcome you home, Sausan, to now what is the permanent and new home of the Women in Public Service project here at the Wilson Center. We are proud of all what you have achieved using the platform of the Women in Public Service project. And this platform has given you an opportunity to scale even greater heights. Today, as a Yale Global Fellow. So we are proud to welcome you home. We are proud to claim you as one of ours. Sausan is also a leading constitutional and human rights lawyer in Israel, and she thrives on using the Israeli constitutional rights to vindicate the rights of minorities in Israel. She will speak about the seminal right to dignity in the Israeli constitution and the jurisprudence, the evolving and developing jurisprudence on the right to dignity. Yes, thank you.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. Rangita, I owe you a lot since the first Women in Leadership project in Wellesley College, which we had great time, and I owe you even more for the support and empowerment to get to the Yale Fellow program where I am now and having great time. So I'm actually a constitutional lawyer. I'm a Palestinian citizen from Israel. I am not going to talk about the Israeli law or the situation of the Palestinian women inside of Israel, but I'm actually I have been thinking a lot of an initiative that me and another colleague of mine have individually initiated with the Palestinian feminist organizations in Palestine on tackling an issue that probably might be a solution if it is being used well and constantly by lawyers, whether women lawyers or men lawyers who have a feminist jurisprudent a strong background. And what I mean by that is, many people, correctly of course, and this is the right way, are trying to tackle the constitutionalism or the constitutionalization of the right to equality between sexes in new constitutions in the Arab world, whether in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and in other places, or putting the emphasis on the importance of having women in the drafting committees of the new constitutions. But I all the time like to tackle the question of what happens if not. So what happens if this doesn't succeed? What happens if the right to equality is not incorporated in the new constitution? So the solution or the mechanism that we are now starting to use, we have been using a lot in the Israeli courts defending the rights of Arabs inside of Israel. And now we are making trainings for feminist organizations in Palestine in order to strengthen the usage and the litigation of the constitutional right to dignity in the courts, mainly in the Palestinian courts. Now, why the right to dignity? The right to dignity has huge importance in the abolishing movement of slavery. It has a huge importance in the women's movement in the beginning of the 20th and the late 19th and even during the 18th century. It has a huge role in the shaping as well of the international law after the Second World War, where there was a shift from the status of sovereignty of the states to the sovereignty of the individual, namely the dignity of human persons. And dignity was incorporated actually with a huge consent from the West and from the East in order to be put and incorporated as the basic right and principle of the UNDHR, which is actually as well accepted and adopted by the West and by the East. So using the right to dignity is a very important tool because it has a huge consent. While equality might have been tackled and attacked by some of the, let's say, Islamic Brotherhood or Hamas or, even the Fatah if we take Palestine, or even in Israel if we take the Arab women or Arab Islamic movement, or even the Jewish Haredi movement. So equality sometimes might be a little bit difficult to promote, while dignity is not. The second thing is that if we look at the international, at the Bill of Rights, International Bill of Rights of Women, which is CEDAW, it incorporates the right to dignity in the preamble and in different articles of the CEDAW, and none of the countries, not even Egypt or Tunisia, has any reservation on the right to dignity, while the reservation exists on the right to equality, because this is the way how they can tackle achieving and promoting the right to equality for women. Now, why dignity and not equality? Because dignity is the umbrella of all human rights. It even includes the right to equality. Dignity is used in litigating in many of the courts when there is a violation or where is the demand to achieve the self-autonomy of the person, mainly women, or where there is a demand in order to achieve the self-determination of the person, the personal autonomy, the realization of the self, the self-worth, combating or challenging psychological and physical integrity, and as well when we are talking about humiliation. So many of the courts around the world have used the right to dignity in order to tackle the violation of the right to equality when it gets as well to gender inequality. This has been used as well in many cases in the Indian courts, in the Bangladesh court, in the Western court as well. We can take a look example on Germany, France, and the European Court for Human Rights. It has been well used as well in the Israeli courts, and in the training that we did for the feminist organization in Palestine, we as well try to train the feminist women lawyers to start incorporating, litigating the right to dignity in the Palestinian courts. Now, of course, we are not so naive. We know that it is not going to be very easy, mainly because public interest lawyering, litigating dignity should be part of public interest lawyering and part of constitutional lawyering. And we all know that this part of litigation is not well developed. And this is why I would like as well to put that on the table, that it's not only important to call for ensuring the right to equality in the Constitution or having quotas for women in the drafting committee or in the political representation. But what I'm calling for is the tackling, is the strengthening of from the other side, for lawyers themselves, for women lawyers who are tackling the issues of inequality in the different courts. Now, what we tried to do as well is to, because we know, like if we take, for example, the Palestinian Basic Law, which is a very developed Palestinian constitution. It has been based and written after they compared it with many of the constitutions around the world. And it also has the right to equality between men and women, but it doesn't have the right to dignity. So we looked at the case laws in the Palestinian courts that relate to family law and that relate to sexual harassment. Now, again, I don't want to put the Palestinian context as is, because I cannot disconnect it between having an occupation in Palestine, which the Israeli occupation is putting a lot of obstacles on the achievement and the promoting of the equal rights to women. Whenever there is a violation of international humanitarian a provision that leads to impacting the right to women, of course they approach the Israeli law. But when there is issues of personal status or sexual violence or domestic violence or issues that are within the Palestinian society, so the only option, of course, is going to Palestinian courts, and there is the mechanism that we wanted to tackle. And having as well in the Palestinian Basic Law, despite the fact that there is a right, incorporation of the right of equality between sexes, or actually non-discrimination, a prohibition of discrimination based on sexes. So it does exist in the Palestinian constitution. However, Sharia is as well the source of law. So how do you tackle that? You go again to dignity, because dignity is as well have been acknowledged and recognized in the Quran. man is has been created in the image of God. The Palestinian basic law says that Palestine is part of the Arab world, so this is as well, when litigating, we can refer as well to regional contexts, such as the revised Arab Charter for Human Rights or the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights. Some of the women feminism might not be delighted about that, but it's kind of a way to tackle and use the tools that we have now to achieve women equality through dignity. So both the Arab Charter, Arab Revised Charter on Human Rights, and the Cairo Declaration for Human Rights do acknowledge and do recognize the dignity and the equality between sexes based on dignity. So the other thing that and as well, in addition to that, the Palestinian Basic Law says that as a future state, it will do everything in order to rapidly join and ratify the international conventions. And even in 2009, the Palestinian president had issued a decision to unilaterally ratify CEDAW. So here is again another platform which actually bases the litigating of dignity on the fact of the state obligation that it has to international convention and CEDAW in particular, which themselves incorporate dignity. So it's trying to base the legitimacy of using the right to dignity based on the local law, based on regional law, and based on international instrument. Now, I have how much time still? Just two, 3 minutes? Okay. So basically this, the way to do it is not simple. What we did in the training is as well, of course, mapping all the constitutions of many countries, mapping hundreds of case laws, both in India, Bangladesh, Canada mainly, because it has a very well developed concept of what the right to dignity is and how we litigate dignity and when dignity is being violated. And we did all that, and we brought the case law to the women who we trained. And basically what we did is that we are trying to make usage of the process of what's called global constitutionalism and bring it from the theory of global constitutionalism to how it really can be fought on the ground. Now, why now? Why now talk about dignity, and why now even call for the incorporation of not only equality but also dignity in the new constitutions? Because, as I said, dignity has been incorporated in the international law after the Second World War, and all the new constitutions that have been drafted after the Second World War, during the late 80s and the 90s, all the constitutions that have been drafted after a period of transition, whether a transition after conflict or whether transition, any kind of other transition, like for instance in South Africa, all those new constitutions or the drafting committee really made the usage of this constitutional moment of having a transition, writing a new constitution, and making usage and advantage of this moment to really incorporate the right to dignity as a separate right, and as well the principle of dignity as principle of and values where the new country and the new constitution should be as well supported upon. So again, it is a very, I'm not saying this is the solution, but this is a step that we are using. This is a step and an idea that I'm as well trying to promote in writing and in doing more training for feminist organizations, hopefully all around our area. And it is just a step really to tackle, or parallelly to tackle, while the situation or while the efforts of many of the other women leaders are trying to incorporate it officially. So I will stop here and leave it to Q&As later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sausan. What a powerful guarantee of human rights, the right to dignity. And you spoke so evocatively about the fountainhead of all rights, the right to life in the Indian constitution, which really forms the bedrock of human rights guarantees from which all other rights emanate from. And the Indian Supreme Court has said that the right to life is really meaningless unless you interpret it in the context of the right to live with dignity. So I think that is really at the core of our conversation, the right to life and the right to live in dignity and with dignity. And that goes to the core of, the right to the rights as well as the legal and the political rights that we've been talking about. And with that, I want to open the panel for questions. And I know that you're bursting with questions. This has been such an interesting morning. Yes. You, Ali, Anna, will you help with the? And I'd like you to introduce yourself too.
Zainab Al-Swaj, Executive Director of the American Islamic Congress. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. My question is for Ms. Coleman about the quota in the Egyptian parliament and what is the status on that right now, and with all the changes that we have seen in the past few months. And what is the percentage basically?
So right now, there is a quota that was passed for women in municipal elections, not in the parliament. But women in Egypt are organizing to try to get a quota in parliament, but not yet.
Yes, I think in the interest of time, we're going to take 2 questions at a time. So Carol, and you had a question. And
Yes, I'm Carol Murphy, a former policy scholar here and a journalist. My question or my comment goes to Sausan and the issue of dignity. A big problem in the Middle East when it comes to promoting women is that the more Islamic-oriented people have a different conception of things like dignity, equality. So how do you deal with people you meet or women you meet who say, well, I have a full life of dignity, but she accepts, all the restrictions that are imposed by the traditional interpretation of Sharia, which is different from a modernist interpretation of Sharia.
Thank you. My name is Fariba Parsa. I'm a business scholar at George Mason University Center for Study of Gender and Conflict. I'm doing research on Iranian women. And my question is, I think it's one thing that Ms. Farahnaz has mentioned. Law do make a difference. In Iran, last week, the Iranian parliament has passed a law that make men permission to marry their adopt daughters. And many Iranian women organizations, they began to collect signatures and trying to remove this law. And this, the power of this women organization is extremely limited, and the government of Iran, they do everything to that this law can be implemented. And actually, it has passed 2 weeks ago. I'm thinking at what the international society, all these women organization can do. We can do for remove this law. Thank you.
What I will do is I will ask Dr. Halia Esfandiari to tackle this, and then I'll just say one sentence at the end.
good. Oops, that's right. Can I have this on this slide?
Safsan, you have to respond to it.
Thanks.
Of course.
You're right. Thank you. The Iranian parliament did pass this law last week, but it was not an independent law. It was a clause in a large bill, so it passed through parliament. But it created such a reaction inside Iran, even among the clerical community. And my sense is that they are in the process of repealing it. And also, don't forget that no law in Iran becomes law until it passes through the Guardian Council. And I think the reaction to this law has been so strong that the Guardian Council will not reject it. But interestingly enough, or sadly enough, it was not picked up by the women's movement around the world. Usually there is an immediate reaction, but I don't think they did react to this. But in Iran itself, they are, and my sense is that this will be repealed within the next couple of weeks when the Guardian Council will look at it. And especially since you have now a vice president for women's affairs who is a reformist woman, and at her at her swearing-in ceremony, there were women from all walks of life, reformist, feminist, women who were member of the campaign, so I mean, it worries us, but I don't think it will ever become law.
I just have, is this on? I just have a quick comment at the end for you on that. Also, I think at the moment with President Rouhani trying very, very hard to project a more positive and pluralistic image of Iran right now because of the economy and all of those issues, I agree with Dr. Sfandiari that I think that this hopefully is going to go away soon. So fingers crossed, we should every little bit of good news would be positive. But yes, it was absolutely appalling. Thank you for the question.
And it's important, I think your question raises the whole importance of women remaining vigilant, even about something that may not go forward. But early action is really imperative. Savsan?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. It's not that it's not an issue that escaped our minds when we were dealing with it. We know that there are many obstacles, but I think it then would depend on the strategy of what case you take and you begin with in order to start such a grassroots litigation reform. You can take it already from, let's say, litigate and challenge polygamy, let's say, with the right to dignity, or challenge, let's say, the fact that women have to have a wali when they get married and men don't. So you need, first of all, to have like a very strategic way of thinking on picking the first few cases, and you can't be alone, because this should come incorporate as well with good training for the women lawyers themselves as well as the judges themselves. Now, in the context of Palestine, it's a little bit difficult to have the training. They did have a training in the West Bank, and the Canadian judges, even the Supreme Court judge of Canada was, and they participated in a training for the judges on how to incorporate the right to dignity in their own judgments. But because as well the ban that has been set by Israel on the movement from Gaza to West Bank and back forth, it's very hard to make all the judges and all the judiciary participate in such trainings. So it is, of course, you like, for instance, we would recommend to have it more on in domestic violence, or in sexual harassment, or in rape issues, things that are really more controversial, that you have a public debate on in the media, and then use the case to litigate the right to dignity. You must first start with cases that you have a public debate that is agreeing to the cause and agreeing to the really violation of the specific human rights in context, and then you start building building upon the successes. It takes time, of course, but it should be a good start.
Thank you. You.
Thank you. Marina Ottaway, senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. My question is probably mostly for Isabel, but it really relates to a lot of things. You have all pointed out to how conservative, patriarchal Arab societies are, right? The MENA region is essentially. And in the process of, and this plays a very important role in the process of constitution making, because if you have a process of constitution making, as it is in Tunisia, for example, which is fairly inclusive. It really embraces a large part of the society, essentially, in terms of who is involved. It seems to me that you are bound to have a constitution which is, in a sense, more conservative than the one that was passed by Bourguiba, the 1956 constitution, that was a very progressive constitution, but was imposed. Essentially, it was not. So what we know is that constitutions that last the most, that are more effective, are the ones around which there is a consensus. So that it seems to me that all these countries are now facing a trade-off between a constitution which is better from the point of view of women's rights, from, in absolute sense, and a constitution that really represents a consensus, a developing consensus in the society. And I'd like to hear your opinion.
Thank you. We'll take one. Fatima?
I think we had really food for thought for the four speakers. I'm addressing the issue of quotas, which I felt that Isabel is not very supportive of. There's always a trade-off between quantity and quality, and we've faced this in the MENA region. In the Moroccan elections, they filled the quota with their mothers, their daughters, their friends, which made a very bad case. But the statistics show that whenever countries, even in the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, which have the highest, or Rwanda, which has the highest above parity, they use the quota. What we're saying, this is an interim measure. It's not a silver bullet. It has to be accompanied by other things. You mentioned the zipper quotas, the smaller districts. There are many conditions for women to succeed. So there is always a trade-off, but it's worth the try to have us there, to have women there. The second issue is with Miriam. Maybe what we need to talk about when we talk about tax laws is how to define heads of households. This, the Jordanian government made it like a decade ago, 10 years ago, and they defined what a head of household is, and this included women. A percentage of income that they earn. And this means that you don't need to go through the... I want to ask you what you mentioned that you're cooperating with the CEDAW committee. If you can tell me which committee you're mentioning. And I would like to talk to Sausan, because this is what we're looking for, innovative approaches. This is worth the trial, but they're not mutually exclusive. That's that we had to fight in Beijing until 5 a.m. because the Arab countries, my name is Fatma Sbeti Qasim. I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. And I was the former head of the director of the Center for Women at United Nations Beirut, now Beirut. The issue is that equity, the Arab countries wanted to push for equity instead of equality. And the UN, it's not that I'm taking this against you as a UN, no. We are looking for innovative approaches. The past has not worked out for women. We should look for other, but they're not mutually exclusive. This is what I'm trying to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, you want to take Marina's question? Sure.
Marina, your question gets right at the heart of it. When you have transitions that bring through a democratic process a conservative majority to power, what do they do with it? And, you know, from my perspective, the real heart of democracy is protecting minority rights. So it's not just imposing majority will, but it's also protecting minority rights. And, you know, look, in Tunisia's case, I think the big inflection point was not including Sharia in the constitution. And, you know, what the parliament will do with laws going forward will inevitably trend in a more conservative direction than Bourguiba. I mean, Bourguiba gave women abortion rights, you know, almost a decade before American women got abortion rights. Abortion's a very controversial subject in this country. Things like that are going to continue to be, I'm sure, controversial in Tunisia, as will components of family law and other things, but not presaging everything on Sharia, I think, was a real inflection point. Egypt, let's remember, had Sharia in its constitution and always has had Sharia, and every poll in Egypt says a vast majority, 85% of the population, wants Sharia. So the new constitution was inevitably going to have Sharia, but they went further by instituting a new process to have laws vetted by a religious group, by Al-Azhar. And this was something new in the Egyptian constitution. And I think that the new version, and it was very controversial, and clearly there's going to be, the idea is that there would be a battle over who would control that religious group that's going to vet laws in Egypt. And in this new version of the constitution, my guess is you'll see that come out. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. It'll be a battle. But how it will be formed and everything will continue to be a big battleground. So you will have undoubtedly more conservative laws, but laws matter. I mean, this is one thing I strongly agree with. And when you have a constitution that immediately puts everything under this rubric of Sharia, it puts, I think, women a step backwards. So to me, that was a real inflection point in Tunisia's case. And let me just quickly say something on quotas. It's interesting because I just did a BBC World debate on quotas, and I was the proponent for quotas. They had an Irish parliamentarian who's adamantly against quotas. There's a new law in Ireland to include 30% for women. I'm not against quotas. I'm just realistic in what quotas can and cannot do. I think quotas have been remarkable as in jump-starting a process in many countries. And in fact, without them, women would never get a seat at the table. But I also want to recognize that we here in Washington should not think, oh, they've got a quota, women are fine. You know, because we've seen it not work out so well for women. Using quotas, that it can in fact be manipulated in a way that uses women to put the imprint of conservative ideology on laws. And I think that's even worse in some ways.
Faranaz has begged me for a minute to respond to that. Yes.
Fatma, I will just tell you, in my own personal experience, these, as you said, mothers, sisters, whatever, who come in to Parliament on reserved seats, no. We had women who were party workers, women from all walks of life who came in on party lists depending on the party, as I said, if it was more progressive or not. Also, what changes is it doesn't matter how you get in. You have a vote that is equal to a man when they come to you, including in your party, for your vote on a bill that they want to be passed. That's when what we did in Pakistan was we developed a women's caucus that had women from every political party, okay? And we would decide that, okay, if we are going to vote on this bill, right, what are we going to get out of it? Okay, then what we're going to do is we are not going to force them to table our acid, crimes, and control bill. So, you know, women who knew nothing about politics, perhaps, or who had dealt with politics at the council level and district level, once you're at the table, you become a politician. So it's very important to be at the table, but that's my personal thing. No, I don't think it's a perfect thing at all. But I do think it's a crucial, not just first step. We have such a long way to go.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Let me just add very quickly. You mentioned something, Farah, that is so important, which when you look at quotas used in Iraq and Afghanistan, it has brought women into parliament that have mirrored very conservative parties. But the one place where they have had an impact is when they have come together in a caucus and to push forward a specific legislation that women can put aside party lines and come together, whether it's a widow's bill in Iraq or a child welfare bill in Afghanistan. These things have passed through the efforts of a women's caucus.
And this is such a healthy debate to have, and I'm so glad that we are raising this to the surface. I'm going to ask Miriam, because she's yet to speak, to respond to your question about heads of household. And this reminds me of one of Miriam's colleagues wrote to me once to say, how can women be heads of state when they cannot be heads of household, when they're not recognized as heads of household? So that really goes to the core of our work at the Women in Public Service Project. And I also want to very quickly respond to your question and your comment about the need for innovation and the need for new thinking about, all challenges. And the UN Women's recommendation to the post-2015 goals includes this provision, which interestingly calls for gender equality in the distribution of capabilities. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's study on the importance of gender equality in capabilities. So this is also another way, an innovative way of thinking about gender equality, just the way in which Sausan is rethinking innovatively about dignity. Miriam?
Okay. Answering to your suggestion to define head of household, actually the text was addressing taxpayers. So taxpayers in Arabic was al-mukallaf. So it says that taxpayer having a spouse as a dependent, that's how, no, because al-mukallaf was interpreted as being the male taxpayer. We try. Actually, women organization are the one asking for, not saying, mukallaf, taxpayer in masculine. Means also incorporates women. They wanted the term to be both al-mukallaf wal-mukallafa, to specifically say that it includes the feminine gender. So that's what happened to the tax law a year ago. That's how we amended it. Concerning the collaboration between the Bar Association and the Lebanese Council for the National Council for Lebanese Women, this is the organization, the state organization. It is a state organization. Exactly. This collaboration is a collaboration for the listing of the discriminatory laws and the follow-up on the amendment of the discrimination. You were talking about Maître Iqbal Dougan, who is also involved in this.
Thank you, Miriam. And all of your questions will be taken. Our panelists are going to stay on. And those questions that I have not been able to take, you can ask after the second panel. I have to close now. I want to close with the words of Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan. And these words were spoken at the 68th session of the UN General Assembly and will help to set the stage for our next panel on women's economic rights. Prime Minister Abe said, "The growth of Japan will benefit the world. Japan's decline would be a loss for people everywhere. So how does Japan aim to realize this growth? What will serve as both a factor for and outcome of growth will be and only be the power to mobilize women." This is a theory of womenomics which asserts that the more women advance in society, higher the growth rate of a society, creating an environment in which women find it comfortable to work and enhancing opportunities for women to work and to be active in society is no longer a matter of choice for Japan. It is instead a matter of the greatest urgency. And I think these words resonate elsewhere outside of Japan. And I hope we'll set the stage for the next panel's discussion. Thank you.
Walking. I'd like to really thank the former panelists for giving us so much food for thought and creating so much discussion. I was telling one of my colleagues that I got inspired by what Farahnaz said, and our next meeting probably is going to be on a seat at the table, as simple as that. And to see why in the MENA region, for every seat at the table, we have to fight and fight and fight. And for example, before the revolution, there were 23 women parliamentarians in the Iranian parliament. Today, the numbers vary between 7 and 9. And so, you know, something fundamental needs to be done there. It took almost 3 decades to appoint one woman to the cabinet, and oddly enough, it was under President Ahmadinejad, who is not going down into Iranian history as a gender-friendly president. On the contrary. Our second panel is going to be the role of women in economic reform and social change. I remember when I joined the Women's Organization of Iran in the late 60s, the discussion was among us how to make women economically independent to be able to have a bigger say in the family. So in those days, you know, what we could do was organize vocational classes and arrange for the product to be sold by the branches of the women's organization. So we were very proud of buying sewing machine, distributing sewing machines, and making sure they would do embroidery, and we would take this stuff and sell it. And I became very curious to see what the women did with the money they gained from this work. What does economic independence mean for them? So I went to one of our branches and saw the women working, and I said, what do you do with the money? Do you put it in a bank? And one of them looked at me and said, bank? You know what is my bank? This is my bank. And she showed me all these bangles. And I said, how come? She said, you know what? Because to open a bank account, I need my husband. And he can then go to that bank and take out all the money. But there is no way he can remove these bracelets from my arm. And if I need money, I go to the goldsmith, I sell it, I spend the money, then I earn money, I go and buy another one. We have come a very long way since those days, and the sheer number of women entrepreneurs in Iran and across the region is just phenomenal. Today's panel is going to be chaired by my friend and colleague, Karen Murphy, who graciously accepted to step in. She's a former reporter of the Washington Post, was from 2011 to 2012 public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and while she was at the Post, she covered both domestic and international affairs and was a foreign correspondent, and she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting and the George Polk Award for Foreign Reporting for her coverage of Iraq's 1990 occupation from the inside the emirate. During her stay at the center, she finished a book called A Kingdom's Future, Saudi Arabia Through the Eyes of Its 20-something, which was published this year. It's an amazing book if you want to know how the young Saudis think. Please read her book. Carol, you have the floor.
Good morning. Before we get into the business today, I want to give a little pitch from my alma mater, because that's what Jane and I have in common. Jane McAuliffe here, who was honored earlier, and also the Secretary of Health in the current administration, Sebelius, also graduated from the same alma mater, which is Trinity here in Northeast DC. When we went there, it was Trinity College. It's now called Trinity University. So if there's any rich people here who want to donate, it needs your help. You know, when I was in Egypt in the 1990s as the correspondent for the Washington Post, there was a lot of apathy among Egyptians, and this was because the Mubarak regime had decided that politics was not for the ordinary people. You get involved, we're going to have economic reform, economic advancement, and then we'll talk about politics. And that was his mantra for 30 years. Well, now we have the opposite. Now we have everybody involved in politics and the economy in free fall. But, you know, is this good or bad for women? Well, we've heard a lot of different opinions. Now, the previous panel concentrated on women in politics, and this one's going to talk a little bit more about the economy and social change and what women can do and what's happening to them because of these changes. I will introduce the speakers one by one, and they can either sit where they are or they can come up here. It's up to them. I think we'll start with Mushira. Mushira Khattab is a former Minister of Family and Population in Egypt, as well as an Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs and Vice Chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of Child. She's been an ambassador of Egypt to South Africa, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And she's been very active inside Egypt, and one of her big accomplishments was criminalizing female genital mutilation and prohibiting child marriage in Egypt. And she also was instrumental in a 2008 law, the Child Law 126. She was a former Wilson Public Policy Scholar, and currently she chairs the Egyptian Women in Foreign Policy Group of the Egyptian Council of Foreign Affairs. And Mushira's told me she's going to talk a little bit about politics, but also about the economic empowerment of women. Mushira.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. At the beginning, I must thank Dr. Hala Isfandiari and Dr. Rangita De Silva for having this meeting. I want to thank Carol for moderating this panel, but really I want to thank the previous panel because it has been very, very rich. And what you have covered during the first panel will impact a lot on our discussion here. And before I start, I want to comment on the question that you've put, economy or politics. Actually, you cannot separate the two, never. You have to work on a lower level before economy or politics, which is education, socialization, before we can speak about women empowerment in politics or in economy, which brings to us the issue of education. But really, when I received the invitation to this panel and I was invited to speak about economic empowerment and political participation of women in the reformist phase. I said, what reformist phase? I don't think we are yet there. So far from the Arab, so-called Arab awakening or Arab Spring or what have you, we haven't seen any reform so far for women. In Egypt currently, we have embarked on a new stage which gives women much more hope than before for many of the reasons that were discussed in the previous panel. We had the Islamists rule, I will not say for 1 year, but actually their influence was very strong since the fall of Mubarak. And we've seen disasters for the whole society and more importantly for women. So really the question I want to put before we start the discussion is, what do we want? Do we want, now we're talking about the global movement of human rights. Do we really see a global movement where everyone should be part and parcel of this, or we want this global movement for human rights or the global standards for human rights to be exempted when it comes to certain regions? This is the question, because like we've seen in the previous panel, women's issues were used as a distraction, be it in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, wherever, and I think also in Iran. The first pronouncement that was made in any of the countries that have seen the Arab awakening was about women. We've seen that in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, and really I enjoyed very much, Isabel, what you have, the comparison you've made, but the question I put to you is, if things are so good in Tunisia for women, why have they not till now went through with withdrawing the reservations on CEDAW? Actually, the reservations on CEDAW was supposed to be lifted immediately after the fall of Ben Ali, but up till now, they are not withdrawn. And we were in Tunisia with Rangita and a round table, and one of the ladies of Al Nahda, she stood and she said, what withdrawal of reservations you're talking about? There is nothing of the sort. So don't ask us why it didn't go through. And she's right, because if it's not ratified by the parliament, then it doesn't exist. So the question now is, do we consider women as equal? When we talk about human rights, are women equal? Or when it comes to women, we can introduce politics and inject things like democracy without defying democracy? Marina put the question about inclusiveness, and I ask, if I put 5 women in any process representing women, but they are against women's rights, will this be an inclusive process? There are so many terms that we can use to look civilized, to look, beautiful, but as a matter of fact, we pass laws in the name of women's rights, but actually they detract from women's rights. We put constitutions and put an article for women, and actually this article, as it looks beautiful, it kills the rights of women. I mean, it kills it, like the 2012 constitution in Egypt. We had, no role for women was recognized except the reproductive role. Reference to international human rights treaties was deleted, and nobody really objected. So I would say that there is double standards. And instead of using big words or impressive terminology, we have to go deeper and see whether we really recognize women as any human being, as any male, be it a CEO of a big corporate or a male who cleans the street. where do we look at the rights of women? So really, after so much thought, when I received the invitation to speak, I thought maybe I give you a perspective of the MENA region. Where does the MENA region stand when it comes to gender rights? And I want to thank Farah very much, because she has covered a lot of really what I wanted to say. And to answer your question, Carol, economy or politics, the global gender index takes into account 4 elements: education, participation in the economy, political participation, and health and reproductive rights. So this is the 4. If we look at the MENA region, in the 2012, we are the worst performing. This is overall index. If we go into details, economic participation is not so bad, Carol. To comfort you, it's not so bad, and actually women are doing very well economically, but in the informal sector, when they are not rewarded and when their performance is not captured and is not counted in the GDP. And maybe some people would say, oh, the Egyptian economy is taking a downfall now. How do they survive? Actually, the informal economy, the private sector are holding this economy, and women constitute a very important component of this. So the economic participation, we are the worst, but the figures are not as bad as political participation. We will come to it and see. Educational attainment, we are second position, and actually the figures look very good. But again, I go to what was said. Farah spoke about the education of the society and the curriculum and all of that. We have good numbers, but the real picture is much worse than the number reflect, insofar as the quality of education, insofar as the sexist, how to say it, or anti-women content of the curriculum, and anti-minorities in general, intolerance and extremism in the curriculum. But the figures look good in the primary, secondary, and university level. Health and survival is the best performance for our region, and actually Egypt fares very well in this. We are in the third position for the, I took this from the Global Gender Report by the WEF. Sorry, I could not make a better picture. I have to print it. I mean, paint and print, so it may not be very clear, but I think Farah covered this issue very well. Now, when we come to the political empowerment, some index, it is very, very low, and we have the worst, like has been said. Now, for the global gender gap, this is not my computer. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Last one. This is, if you want to see, you can just, on this, you can stop on any. Saudi Arabia ranks 131. You can take Iran, I think is ranks 127. Turkey 124. This is very important, as it can show us what's happening in the different parts of the world. I have to be really quick because of the time. What I wanted to focus on really is Egypt, and Carol asked me to put more emphasis on the economic part. No, sorry, before that, the UNDP gender, before I go to Egypt, the UNDP Human Development Index The 2013 report is about the rise of the South. The report, all reports of the UNDP on human development send a very basic message, which is economic growth on its own is not enough and will not automatically translate into human development progress, which is really very important. The 2012 report showed that most countries, especially with those of the lowest score, have achieved progress from 2000 to 2012. Despite this fact, the performance of the MENA region within this South is not at its best. But really, from examining all of this, one reaches the conclusion that there is a lot of difference between the different countries in the MENA region that will make it difficult to make any general statements. Farah spoke about the struggle of Egyptian women, where women's rights in Egypt were achieved many, many years back. Actually, Egyptian women have scored a lot of progress. And I believe if it were not for the abuse of religion to push a culture, and I'm being very careful in what I say, abuse of religion to push a culture that marginalizes and discriminates against women, Egyptian women and women in the MENA region in general would have really made a better success and really would have been at a better place. Hale, when we started this panel, she put a question or a theme: how much are women involved in this? And I think this is a very important parameter to look at. And the simple question I give is that women are very involved and women are very active. I enjoyed very much reading an article for Isabel. It was written before the Arab Awakening, where she compared Egyptian feminist movement with the Irani movement, and she criticized the Egyptian feminist movement for being inactive or not as active as the Irani movement. I want really to get your reaction now after the Arab Awakening. This is one of the achievements, is that women are more active. Women have really emerged stronger despite attempts of severe marginalization during the last 3 years. The society in the last 3 years have tried so hard to push them aside, but despite that, women have been very active and they have scored big success. If you look at the issue of sexual harassment, it was women and women's organizations who took it upon themselves to tackle this. We've just had our feast ending today, and this is the season when sexual harassment is at its peak because everybody is in the street celebrating. This feast witnessed the lowest ever cases of sexual harassment, thanks to women and women's movements, and raising the awareness and exposing this issue. So if I come quickly, I will have to skip because of the time. Women lost a lot of rights in the 2012 Constitution. Religion was given a very suspicious role. Isabel spoke about the role of Al-Azhar. They gave the clerics a role over the legislator. And they defined Sharia in a very strict manner. And actually, there is no problem with putting Sharia in a constitution. If you have a culture that really believes that everyone is equal, then there will be no problem in Sharia. But you may not have a reference to Sharia. You can have the best laws, the best constitution, but the application is very discriminatory. And this is what we have seen in the 2012. We've lost the female vice head of the Constitutional Court. We've lost female heads of universities. It was really a disaster for women. So the economic participation of women and the Arab awakening and how it affected women's economic participation. Since 2011, the Egyptian economy is having a nosedive. It affected everyone, and it affected women more than anyone else. We've seen a sharp decline in foreign investments, and we have seen, I'm trying to pick the important figures to give you here. The unemployment rose, of course. Worse than that, the demand on labor at home and abroad has declined severely. According to CAPMAS, the unemployment reached 3.5 million, and as a result of this figure, we have seen that while 9.6% of the males in the market were unemployed, 24.7% females in the labor market were unemployed. I mean, females fit and willing and wanting to work. So the gap is very bad. According to the Economy Watch, unemployment rate in 2010 was 9.1. In 2013, it climbed to 13.55. And the forecast for 2014 is 14.26%. According to the IMF and the World Bank, having as many women in the labor force as men could boost economic growth by 5% in the US, 9% in Japan, and 34% in Egypt. So this will show you how economic participation of women is very important. Now, to catch up and to really close, to catch up with what was said about the Islamists and the liberals and women, now the Egyptians are given another opportunity to build a civic state based on the rule of law. The current situation puts a challenge for the liberal. Are they really keen on an inclusive society where women will be equal, or they are as hypocrite as their Islamist compatriots? Because this is the time now. Egyptians now are very optimistic that they will have a good constitution, and we have very good representation of women in the current committee that is writing Egypt's constitution. Like was said, there is a debate about a quota for women, but more importantly, below the quota, how to prepare women to have a seat without a quota. So women are very empowered. They are very optimistic, like the rest of the Egyptians, and they're working very hard right now on the constitution within a roadmap that has a national consensus. And with this roadmap, in 6 months, we should finish the transition, and hopefully we'll have a truly free and fairly elected president and parliament and a constitution that reflects the history and the struggle of the Egyptian people and comes in line with the minimum standards of human rights as the global community has agreed, without any exceptions because of cultural specificity. Because when this word is used, it's used to justify discrimination, and it's usually against women and the minorities. So Egyptians are very hopeful, women are hopeful, and they are counting on the support of the global community for what they're doing now, because right now is a war against using religion to discriminate and terrorize people. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope I have
Thank
been
you,
within the
Mashira.
time.
Thank you, Mashira, very much for that very emotional plea. Our next speaker has been a longtime servant of that much maligned organization called United Nations. She worked there for more than 35 years in Baghdad, Amman, and Beirut. And her last job there was as director of the UN Center for Women, Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. She is a freelance consultant on gender and women's issues in the Arab countries. She's an author and an editor of numerous studies. Her main research interests are interlinkages between political parties, political empowerment for women, and religion. Her book, Party Politics, Religion, and Women's Leadership, will be coming out this fall. And she has a master's degree in development administration from the American University of Beirut and a PhD in political science from Columbia. And she's going to talk about lessons learned, security unraveled, MENA women negotiate uncharted social transitions. Fatima, you have the floor.
Thank you, my dear. First of all, it's so good to be here again. And thank you to Hali and Rangita. I don't have any PowerPoint this time, and I thank Carol. The title of my presentation, you switched.
Oh,
it's okay. It's
yeah,
okay.
you're right.
It's all right. I'll be talking about can women's economic contributions lead to an effective role in the reform process, and that's the main thrust. I will start by saying that I like the presence of more women every time I come, more men. Women are numerous. More men in the audience. And I was inspired by the previous panel, as Mushira said, and by what Mushira has just finished saying. I want to start by saying that reform, if we're talking about reform, is the ultimate goal of any setting, any country, in a setting of war or conflict or what we're going through in the Arab uprisings. And I don't like to call it the Arab Spring because we might be heading for an Arab fall. Let's cross our fingers. In such a setting, one sees that most development indicators intensify. Poverty, job scarcity, low investment, high unemployment among men and women, especially the youth. We haven't talked about the youth. The youth are being targeted. Inequitable distribution of income, which increases the gap between the rich and the poor so that the middle class is slowly disappearing. And widened social cleavages, heightened religious extremism, and in an area where multi-vocalism should be invoked, different interpretations of religion put women in different places. And as was mentioned in the morning, the situation of women is the litmus test in any country. In any country. So let alone a country in transition, being democratized. And you have lingering gender imbalances and widening gaps, wage discrimination, women receive less pay for work of equal value. They still do, even in the States. And more so in the MENA region and the Arab world. Against this backdrop, the role of women in economic reform becomes most difficult, not only for women, but also for men. And the question comes, does violence and political instability leave space for reform? And what could be the role of women in economic reform? The short answer to the visionary but timely concerns raised by the Wilson Center is that women's involvement in the reform process of democratizing countries or those still immersed in chaos associated with violence and unrest remains limited. I'll explain why by sharing some facts and statistics, highlighting some challenges, and offering few pragmatic recommendations trying to steer away from the normative. We must recognize that reform is a holistic process in which economic, social, political, legislative, and administrative domains are all interdependent and interlinked, including reform of the educational and health sectors. Reform initiatives are often resisted in societies. We have to put this in front of us. Those societies are enshrined with patriarchy, with gender bias, and women-unfriendly political culture. This is where we're starting from. Moreover, in a region marked, or rather cursed, by unrest, political instability, occupation, armed conflict, women and children are the most affected. Violence and wars have always had a differential impact on women and children, so let alone women in a state of conflict. Nonetheless, this is all the more reason why women should not be marginalized, but their involvement in any reform process becomes not only mandatory, but also a necessity if national development and economic growth are to be attained and democracy consolidated. These countries cannot afford to ghettoize women or half of their human resources and human capital. Women's potential contribution to the reform process must be tapped and mobilized as full-fledged citizens. As Isabel mentioned many things, and I will get back to that. I share with you some facts. There are many indicators about on the role of women in the economic sector. Their share in the labor force, which is the most commonly invoked indicator, not necessarily the most correct. This is the baseline from where you can start any reform initiative. Women account on average in the Arab world, in the 22 Arab countries. I'm talking about a specific group of countries, not the whole MENA region, the 22 Arab countries, which is my forte. 29%, less than 30% in the labor force. This is one of the lowest worldwide. Now, I want to talk something about statistics. Statistics differ, and this is what we always contest in the UN. The UNDP gives one figure, the UN Secretariat another figure, the World Bank gives us other figures, the IMF still other figures. We try to consolidate it. There's a database where all those sources come together, but there are still discrepancies. Countries report those statistics for political reasons. Poverty in Lebanon might be like 10%, where half of the population is poor, just to give an example. So, granted, there are wide discrepancies across countries. For example, women comprise 43% in Comoros, Mauritania, and Somalia. These are agroeconomies, where women are in the agricultural sector. They are between 30 and 35% in Morocco, Lebanon, Tunisia, Egypt, and Sudan. Between 26 and 28% in Algeria, Yemen. I've grouped them because it's easier to talk about groups of countries. Algeria, Yemen, Syria, Jordan, and Kuwait. 20 to 25% in Bahrain, Libya, and Iraq. The lowest shares are in the Gulf countries. 13 to 18% in Oman, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. Not Kuwait. Kuwait is more advanced. And the UAE even. Not the UAE. On average, 70% of working women are in the services sector. And I'm always talking on average. The mean discrepancies are their disparities. This is understandable since the region is not industrial oriented. It's more service oriented. So you will find women mostly in the service sector. The rate of female economic activity, and this is another indicator that is important in economics, in in capturing the economic contribution or participation of women. You take women 15 years and above. This is highest in Yemen, imagine. 88% of adult women work in agriculture. And these are not the latest figures available. In 2008, you have 60% in Morocco, 51% in Iraq, 47% in Egypt, and in Palestine, 28%, in Syria, 24%. You'll notice that these rates of economic activity, female economically active population, are high in these countries because they are agroeconomies. Much lower female economic activity is recorded among young women, between 15 and 24. These dismal rates translate into high rates of female unemployment. Mushira mentioned that, compared to men. The highest female unemployment rate is in conflict-stricken. Palestine, 26%. Countries of the Arab uprisings in Yemen, 40%. Jordan, 24%. Iraq and Egypt, 20%. And Syria, 22%. These are all countries of the Arab uprising where women's unemployment rate is very high. The nice thing about it, the positive thing, the flip side is that those women are looking for employment. I can't believe it. Are not finding it.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah. Okay, these are high unemployment rates. But you have to consider that this is the influence of globalization, economic recession, political instability, popular uprisings, the quality of education, and how this matches market needs. There's a big mismatch there. However, one must go beyond numbers and number crunching. Statistics may be misleading. In the Gulf countries, they include foreign labor in national statistics, so you get a mixed message. Another caveat is that disaggregated statistics on the economic performance of women is underestimated, is not included, as Mushira said, in national accounts. In the informal sector, and even when women work at home, their contribution, if I get somebody to work in my home as a domestic helper, I have to pay her money, okay? This is not counted. This is not counted in national statistics, and this means that what you look at economic contribution of women is very much underestimated. Now, given this, as I said before, given these statistics, women have to be active and their contributions recognized, because it is in the national interest of governments to include them. But when they look at the statistics, they find that they do not contribute anything, so they are set aside. This is in normal circumstances. But you look at I must say that at this point in time, the women's gains over the years, since 1975, if I may say so, have been really much more than the women's gains in the political domain. So there's a mismatch. And the number of CEOs in the private sector worldwide, if you look at the Fortune 500 ratings, it's not more than 10% worldwide. So why do we want to expect that women in this part of the region should have a better picture? I can say that in Lebanon, it's like 33% of women in the private sector are managers and CEOs. So their contribution is recognized, but their political contribution is still not, it's 3.1%. So these are the barriers. Women's issues are placed at the back burner. Women are active, they grumbled, they lobbied, they are still working, but it remains to be seen. Where do we get that? You look in Saudi Arabia with the laws that have been passed recently, you'll find more and more business entrepreneurs, women businessmen, successful. The head of the role model is Saudi Arabian, head of the women's entrepreneurs. I forgot her name. So this is the business women and entrepreneurs, when they have equal access to credit, to loans, which they do not have, to financial resources, they can do much better. They are not doing that because of the laws. But there's always, even if you get the laws, you put them, you should monitor their implementation. There's always a gap between the de jure and the de facto. Now, I have many recommendations, and as Isabel mentioned, in the case of Tunisia, women's economic empowerment is very important, and they proved themselves. But there are other countries, if you take countries separately, you have success stories, and you can showcase them. I'm going to stop at that before. I still have 6 minutes?
No, you have 2.
Okay. So what is the what are some recommendations? Some recommendations are that governments should recognize, women should impose themselves, impose their presence, work more, so that governments recognize that the merit of including them, involving them in economic reform. Gender-sensitive legislation should be enacted to eliminate gender discrimination in the workplace and empower women economically. I am a staunch supporter of quotas, of affirmative action. I mean, we've been through that in the first panel. I don't think women will reach anywhere unless they sit at the table. And they have to be given the chance to, even though some of them may not play the part of good legislators. We have to give them. There is what we call the moderation theory, and let's give them the chance, although we gave the chance to the the Ikhwan, and they failed. Okay, so we have to compile realistic sex disaggregated statistics in order to be able to set the tone for women. In releasing the 2013 report on women, business, and law, the World Bank president said that, and I'm going to end with this, when women and men participate in economic life on equal footing, they can contribute their energies to building a more cohesive society and more resilient economy. This is true, for instance, look at Saudi Arabia and what's taking place. We have many Saudi Arabian role models. And in conclusion, in order to activate and invigorate the role of women in economic reform, we have to remove legal barriers. Only Algeria and Morocco have laws on sexual harassment in the workplace. There is a dire need for strategic vision to combat feminization of poverty, women's unemployment, female illiteracy. Half of Arab women are still illiterate. They are illiterate. So how do we expect them this may involve a shift from neoclassical economic thought and policies to a more liberal, women-friendly and gender-sensitive approach. And governments should realize that it is in their interest not to marginalize half of their populations. Finally, on part of women, they should lobby for gender-sensitive legal reform, and they should force their governments in any which way to implement CEDAW and the ILO conventions. There are ILO conventions on women's employment and rights, and venture into new areas and new initiatives, as Sausan has shown us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Now, our third speaker, whose title of her speech I've already given you, but I will repeat: Lessons Unlearned, Security Unraveled, MENA Women Navigate Uncharted Social Transitions. Her name is Kathleen Kunast, and she's director of the Center of Innovation for Gender and Peace Building at the U.S. Institute of Peace. The center focuses on the gendered impacts of conflict and post-conflict transition for both men and women, and also on the role that women should play in peace building. Kunast worked 15 years in the international development field, where her research included studies on community-driven development in post-conflict reconstruction. Her regional expertise is Central Asia, and she's written extensively on the impact of post-Soviet transition on Muslim women. Very interesting topic. She has a doctorate in socio-cultural anthropology from the University of Minnesota. Kathleen?
Thank you, and
Thank
thank you
you.
very much, Carol. Of course, to Hale and Rangita. This is like coming home because many years ago, Hale was my mentor here as a postdoc, and she and I talked a lot about the role of Muslim women after a very unusual and rapid disintegration of the Soviet Union, and she gave me great guidance then and continues to this day. So, Hale, thank you. Well, I'm in, I would say, the unfortunate position to try to pull together the brilliant ideas here, both as not a specialist in the region and also as an anthropologist. It is a tall order, and I am going to try to do my own slight flashlight into this very difficult arena. I pulled on my former notes of a presentation I gave years ago here at the Institute when Woodrow Wilson once remarked at the Paris Peace Conference that you cannot, in human experience, rush into the light. You have to go through the twilight into the broadening day before the noon comes and the full sun is upon the landscape. It's a mouthful, and he certainly was talking about the devastation of World War I and how to anticipate our next corner, in one sense, control our expectations and yet move forward. And I feel very much at this moment when I also look upon the Arab predicament, and I agree with my colleague, it's hard to call it Arab Spring at this moment. But it is an early moment of light, and I think there are lessons here that perhaps we have to unlearn before we relearn. And we have to recognize how deeply the unraveling of security has so rapidly and, if you will, deliberately undermined all our efforts here today, and how to move forward truly in these uncharted social transitions. I'm going to pull upon work that we have been doing at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I, like Hale, have been furloughed for several weeks, and so I'm having to dig out my notes because we were not legally allowed to work. But I have my colleague here, Ambassador Steve Steiner, who has hand in hand with me worked on these concerns. The question came forward to us as we moved from our work in Iraq to our work in Afghanistan. Are we going to make the same mistakes? Do we have, as an international community, and I speak to you from that lens, a blind spot? And what really did work in Iraq, and what could possibly work in Afghanistan, and what would they possibly have in common? And I will then transition into the Arab area, because that is exactly where we took our discussions. Again, I'm an anthropologist, so I spent a lot of time listening, participating by my observations, and trying to find linkages and hopefully patterns that can also build hope in times when it is truly a dark situation for women. Over the last several years, we brought together a group of international experts. Many of them may be in this room, government and non-government, U.S. allied agencies to say what works, what doesn't work. And the key lessons that they provided us, and these were people who were on the ground in Iraq and in Afghanistan when it came to women's programming, were the following. One, there's an enormous divide between the elite and non-elite. There's an enormous divide between the urban and rural because these countries are predominantly rural in terms of their economics. Not only a generational gap between the young and the older generations, but an ideological gap. And that, indeed, as we have so diligently tried to bring women's programming, a gendered notion to all our work in the conflict and post-conflict spheres, that without men as allies, we become another, if you will, silo. And then finally, they recommended, how do we find in this tremendous shift where religion has become another ideological framework that certainly the international community is concerned, but also quite hands-off, because it fits under our notion that culture is somehow on a pedestal. And I'm going to attack that as an anthropologist. Nothing is more mutable and movable in human society and civilization than culture, given we can look at war, but we can also look at peace. Given a phenomenal incentive, human society can change on a dime. So I want to just move the religion one off, but how do we actually engage religious leaders? So we went to our Afghan and Iraqi colleagues, women leaders in their country from all different economic and political venues, if you will. They were not happy about meeting with one another. They couldn't see any possible gain in talking to one another. Certainly the Iraqis felt like the Afghans were of another world, maybe 200 years past from that point. And certainly the Afghans didn't see much progress that the Iraqi women have made. And over the period of a week, we were able to finally hear from each of them to say they couldn't believe how many phenomenal ideas the Afghan women actually not only had, but had implemented. And they had learned as well, the Afghans, from the Iraqi women. But their main concern was what in the world was happening in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen. And they said, we need to talk with them. We need a forum in which we can talk about our lessons and whatever we can do to help them, we are there. And so yet, in another set of listening exercises, and we were truly on the outside of these dialogues, we came together to find where there would be possible common ground. And one could not be surprised by the issue of personal security remaining the number one common ground among all of these women leaders. That without this kind of security, being able politically, economically to break through is going to be of great concern. We heard from all of them that with the major rollback of their rights, they see that they're not at any of these peace tables. And yet they also said, we're creating our own tables. We're trying to think outside the box, that there are the main peace tables, but how many other peace tables can we bring to bear? And that a regional perspective may be something that needs to be more in our conversations. They suggested that where can women from the region find common ground and have more emphasis together and impact. As a group, they concurred with the international specialists that the gap between the young and the more mature women activists was at one level almost like a different language. And they were confused in how to bridge that, how to bring younger women and listen to younger women and find where they could bridge that. They saw another gap that is critical and one that people often don't like to talk about, and that was between secular and religious women. The Afghan women said, we live under a constitution where Islam is the rule, but we have never been educated coming out of a secular generation, Soviets there first and then prior to that. They knew nothing about the legal discourse of Islamic law. They want more education as a way to critically deal with it. But the gaps there between youth, religious, secular, were suggested as areas for regional meetings where they could find messaging that could help close some of these gaps. How do we see women becoming more empowered, quote, educated from areas in which economic empowerment from women is considered a threat to men? And how do we bring men in as allies? So I know I could go through a lot of this. We've written a lot about it, so I'm going to try to summarize here. And that is sorting
That's
out.
not from me.
Oh, 6 minutes. Thank you. One of the things that they talked about a lot then was, now that I know I have a few more minutes, I will go back and try to pull some of the threads, is how to build strong coalition among women in these gaps. How do we bring a coalition to bridge the divide between the religious and secular women leaders? How do we bring coalitions together between the rural and urban, and between coalitions of women where we talk a lot about women in parliaments, but many of the women identified the fact that without economic strength behind you, no matter what kind of education I have, what kind of brilliance, what kind of even network, without the economic empowerment, they will never break through. How do we talk about these gaps? And so their recommendations from these series of meetings over the period of 2 years was to find a regional voice to begin addressing very difficult, contentious, if you will, issues that are in effect breaking down women's coalitions in these countries and feeling more and more isolation and less security. It's more of a question than I throw or pose here today, is how to find the linkages as we begin to see the changes, the social transitions underway, not just from an international perspective, because we do need as much listening as possible, but from perhaps coming from the core of the MENA region to develop some sort of arena to help women and men, allied men, I should call them, men who understand the issues of why women's rights are at the focus and the core of human rights and moving forward. That is the moment in time we are in our efforts. And as a way to help sort these recommendations further, we took their recommendations to heart and have set up a symposium for later this month, actually next week, I guess now. What happened to furloughed minds here? On an area, what we call the other side of the gender coin, on men, peace, and security. In essence, to help understand and engage men in their own issues of gendered identity, to help them see what happens in conflict and the macho or the hypermasculinity identities of men in conflict and what that means for women, but as a way of trying to bring men into understanding why gendered issues are not just another name for women, but that it is a very integral and intricate part of understanding human change. And finally, we are looking at this constitutional engagement, an area that is more difficult to traverse, and that is how, for women who have very little access to understanding the Sharia coming out of Afghanistan, for example, how to build a better engine, if you will, for helping them understand the nuances of that law and customary law and what ways they may be able to be change agents. So I'm going to end there as a way of just putting it out there with no conclusions, but this slower process toward the light. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Now, Mushira would like to make a comment on something Kathleen has said. Then I'm going to pose a question, and then we'll open up the floor for questions.
Well, thank you. I think I can leave it for later after the questions. It's only intriguing that these countries have been there for a long time. The communist rule was only for around 70 years. So only now they're coming to discover their religion? This puts a question mark. And what kind of interpretation of religion? And why do we now see a gap between secular and religious women? This really worries me very much, because once you speak about Islamic law, it's only personal status law to subjugate women. There are no other laws. Exactly. So this is only a concern. And I was wishing to hear from you what was the response. Because the serious thing is those clerics who will teach them their religion. They will push them back 2,000 years. Thank you.
Kathleen, do you want to make a comment on that?
I can only comment through the interpretation. This was, in our dialogues, their sense of what was missing, and their sense that in not understanding and not growing up in this religious tradition, and most definitively here, talking about Afghan women, they felt that that was the problem for them. So I think it's their own interpretation of problems and perhaps their own sense of
being manipulated.
That and with very little hope. Very little hope.
Interesting.
What else can we do?
It struck me that we've heard Kathleen and Mushira talk about the gap between, I wouldn't say religious women, I'd say ultra or fundamentalist Because you can be very progressive and be religious as well.
I think that's a very good
Yeah,
clarification.
but obviously we have two different views of how women should act in society. And for shorthand, I'll say the Islamist one and the more progressive or secularist one. There's a gap here. It's a big problem. The gap's got bigger since the Arab awakening began. But it strikes me that on economic issues, there's a possibility for a lot of agreement. I mean, no matter what your religious orientation, you want to feed your family, you want to be able to buy extra bangles for your arm. So I wondered, have you observed any sessions where there's been these women from different orientations coming together to talk about a common economic strategy? And if not, is that possible? So why don't you go first, Mashiro?
No, that's exactly the point. Why do I have to label someone as religious and the other as secular? Why do I have to label people? I mean, these are equal citizens entitled to equal rights regardless of their religion or their inclination or whatever. And instead of focusing on the economic empowerment and education, we focus now on learning our religion. This is really the big manipulation now of the mind.
But
you start to divide people.
But would it be possible to create a strategy, a platform, a forum, a group where women from different orientations could talk only about common economic strategy?
Yes, we're all humans. We all aspire for a better standard of living. Full stop.
Kathleen?
My religion has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the areas in which I've witnessed that is a group called Peace Through Business. They bring together Afghan and Rwandan women. And about a year ago, we had a dialogue with the Afghan and Rwandans. And the one Afghan woman stood up and said, we're really worried. Our international aid is about to disappear. We don't know what we're going to do. And the Rwandan women stood up and one by one gave testimonials about how important it is to move out of the mindset of aid and into taking the power of their own economic development. And it was remarkable. And that is a very different, two cultures, very unique, and yet they could speak to each other in a form of truth that I think as an international we could have never said something.
Fatima, would you like to comment?
Yeah, just to draw your attention to that the microcredits that Muhammad Yunus started in Bangladesh didn't take Muslim or non-Muslim women, rural or urban. Those people, those women who needed microcredit loans were given those loans. So we should not, each in our own way, we should try to put religion, and it's not religion, and I agree with you. It's the intensity of religiosity. I could be very religious, but open-minded. It's the enlightenment, it's the interpretation, it's the multivocal interpretation of religion. It's the intensity of religiosity.
Okay, now we're going to open the floor. The first question will go to Barbara.
Thanks, Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Thanks, ladies, as always. This is terrific. Mushira, I've got a political question for you. I mean, given what's happened in Egypt, how can you really move forward if as it appears, the current government, transitional government, is going to prevent any Muslim Brotherhood people from running for office, and that includes Muslim Brotherhood women and men? It seems to me that you're going all the way in the opposite direction now. After veering off with Morsi, now you're veering off on the secular side. And it seems also to me that if you try to suppress these people completely, you're not going to be able to resolve these differences. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Barbara. This is very important. Actually, everybody is for inclusiveness. Because if you're talking about democracy, then everybody must be on board. But then you must have also the rule of law. And you must try to, look at the interest of the people. And if you try to sabotage bread earning or the bread winning of people, or tamper with their security. If you're following, and I'm sure you are, Barbara, following closely what happens in Egypt, this is a war. It's a war against terror. It's Egyptians trying to regain their, really don't laugh, really, it's true, really. Yes, Egyptians are trying to regain their civil identity. This branding according to religion, look at the number of churches that were burned. I mean, Christians, Egyptian Christians are living in terror. Some villages were really evicted and people are forced to leave certain localities. This is not right. It is true you have a government that was elected and you have a president that was elected, but when the people realized that they were going down a wrong path, they just took to the street. And remember, this is the Middle East. It's not the West. Democracy is not as deep-seated. The rules are not as applied as it is here. But when you have 30 million people go down the street and say, we don't want this president, this is an impeachment process because there was no other constitutional impeachment process. But Egyptians want to include the Muslim Brotherhood. I am the first one who is against the Muslim Brotherhood, and I am the first one to say include them. Why? Because when they ruled, they burned all their bridges. They were the ones who made the Egyptians hate them. And what's happening now in Egypt, commenting again on what Isabel, the comparison she was making, is very significant for the whole region. Because the fight, the struggle that's going on now will determine the fate of abusing religion for political reasons. But we are for inclusiveness. And there are many mediation efforts going from the part of the government and from the part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's only the Muslim Brotherhood. There are other Islamic factions, but they are on board or they are mediating. The Salafis are part of the process and they are mediating. So really, we want to put religion where it belongs, in the mosque or in the church, but not in politics. You must have a law that applies to everyone, and everyone must be accountable. This is this is going to affect the whole region because Egypt and its size will affect the region, and that's why it's really a war.
I'd like to get the conversation back to economic and social matters. So are there any questions on that? No? Everybody wants to stay on politics? Yes, sir. This gentleman here with the beard. No, this one.
Sorry.
Well, actually, I'd like to ask a question about Saudi Arabia. So I guess you're the target. Yes, because I understand that in Saudi Arabia today, not only are a majority of university students women, but a majority of university students in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math, are women. And I'm wondering, what impact has that had on Saudi Arabia? What impact is it likely to have? What trajectory is that likely to follow?
It's a great question. The answer is yes. Like 51% of university students are women. And women make up not 50%, but a good portion, I think it's around 35% of the women now studying abroad on King Abdullah scholarships in 30 different countries. And the fact that they're going into the scientific and mathematic areas is also true. Mm-hmm. They're going into law. There is a quiet revolution, a silent revolution in women's status in Saudi Arabia. Now, other people can look at it and say, what are you talking about? They still have to walk around. They can't drive. They can't do. It's happening very slowly. Yeah. But slowly is better than not at all. And the king has been the foremost advocate of women's rights because he and his advisors recognize that if they're going to develop Saudi Arabia and make it less dependent on oil, which they have to for their long-term economic survival, then they have to get women involved in the economy, in education, and all those things. Okay. Is this about Saudi?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I'll continue where Carol stopped. The index for female higher education is highest in Lebanon, Bahrain, Oman, and Saudi. It's 1.2, which means that more women are into higher education. Not only that, but recently, in May, I think, the king, since he took over, he was pro-women. Slowly but surely, 30 women, he appointed 30 women to the council, to the Shura Council. Of these 30 women, 29 are PhDs and only one princess. And they are working very hard.
Okay. Has somebody got a question on economics? Hale. Oh, yes, please.
My sense is that we Muslim women owe a lot to Khadija. If she wasn't a businesswoman, so we are told, I mean, business would have been also taboo for women. Now, having said that, my question is that how can these business women be effective, you know, in integrating more women in political and social activities? Because some of these women are heads of conglomerate, you know, all the way from Turkey, even in Iran and in the Emirate and so on. So they must be somehow, you know, effective and bring in more women because of their position. I remember, and Fatima was at that meeting, we brought a group of business women with a group of women legislators in Jordan together from across the region. It was amazing how little these business women owed their standing, where they are, their progress to the women who had been fighting on the ground to push for women's rights. You know, it was a two separate world, completely, you know. So how can we bring these two groups together to make their role more effective? That's my...
Are you asking how to raise the consciousness of women who've made it in business to help their...
How these business women who are already there can be influential in raising the consciousness of their male colleagues even on how important it is to integrate women.
Would someone from the panel like to answer, Hale?
No,
She has a question. Yes, Miriam.
I would like to
Respond.
Miriam, can you wait for a microphone, please? So
yeah,
that everybody can...
in the meantime, you asked to answer.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm involved in an organization in Lebanon to promote entrepreneur as a whole and to point out the laws that needs to be reformed in order to attract foreign investors to Lebanon for the economy. We opened a chapter for women entrepreneurs. We held a press conference 2 weeks ago. We hosted women entrepreneurs who succeeded. And we brainstormed the problems and the solution. We, of course, tackled the problem of microcredits for women. We hosted the CEO from banks, and we talked about the issue of how difficult it was to attract, to obtain microcredits from banks. As a result, there are 2 banks who gave access, who created a service in their banks for women to get microcredits. The problem remained for when they need bigger
Guarantees.
Yes. Why? Because one of the religious communities does not allow women to give some of her assets as collateral without the authorization of the husband. This is applicable also in case she inherited the assets from her family. She needs also her husband's approval to put her own assets as collateral to the banks.
Now, is that a Lebanese law, or is it just a fatwa from this
It is
cleric?
a Lebanese law in the personal status of
Okay, so
certain
let's
communities.
talk about this specific case going forward. What is a way to influence these women who are denied these loans to raise their consciousness to do something about this?
We are doing, women organizations are doing things with through the women's organization in order to address this problem. What we are fighting for is to have a civil law personal status, optional. I mean, whoever wants to be governed by the personal status of their own community may have the option to do so, and whoever wants to be ruled by the civil status law would have this option. But again, the religious authorities are opposing it. So what we're trying to do now is try to involve the religious authorities in our fight, which makes more sense.
Yeah.
Now, the ones that are proeminent are it's difficult to make them open their ears. We are targeting young religious
Clerics.
persons.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they become involved in their communities and more helpful. So in a couple of years, maybe they will be able to make a difference.
Very smart to involve the religious community. Faranaz, you had a question?
This is, of course, it's economic related, but all these amazing women in Saudi Arabia who are such huge entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs, medium entrepreneurs, when they don't have control over their own passports, do they ask their husband, oh, I'm a CEO, okay, or I'm a textile, whatever, and can I have my passport to travel? Can you sign the documents? When she has to go to the bank for loans, does she have to take a male relative? How does this work? Because that would only help the elite women. That will not help the middle class women or the women who have SMEs. So I really, this is one thing I want an answer to. The other thing which I'm still can't really, Kathleen, wrap my head around with the youth bulge in Afghanistan, that these women who are talking about, we don't know Islam and we know Islam. Let me, in the Ummah and wherever I've traveled, Arab countries, Iran, Pakistan, India, whatever, whether you are religious or you're not religious, you know your prayers, you're taught your prayers, you know your kalma, you know what Ramzan is, you know these things. So I find it very strange. I feel like you're being pitched a project perhaps that doesn't really, outside of the region, doesn't, I'm not being, please don't take this badly.
No, I don't. No,
I'm just, it's just an input. Thank you, but I want a question on the passport.
Okay, Fatima, you know Saudi well. Do you want to answer Faranaz on this issue and also respond to Hale?
Yeah. Hale, there is under the League of Arab States, the Arab Women's Organization, and there is an Arab Women's Entrepreneur, Businesswomen Forum. And when I was in office, we tried to get them together, especially for this, to get them to speak to each other, because if the entrepreneurs, the businesswomen don't know what are the problems, how can you solve them? You know, they don't want, they have different islands. I'm sure they are following up on this. And I think it's a regional issue, as Kathleen was saying, because there are common denominators. When they bring them together, you know, you can propose a skeleton that each country will implement. So I think we need more on this. What we did in Amman, it should be done more. For the passports, I mean, it's on a country by country level.
She's talking about Saudi.
Saudi Arabia, they have to have a muhram. This has, I mean, you cannot escape it and you cannot fight it. You know, whenever I used to go there, even talking about gender equality was a taboo. I would say family, equal opportunity. You have to not knock your head against the wall. You have to go through like dignity and yeah. There is no way. Yeah.
Yes, Halle.
Quick example. Farah Naz. I remember a case when I was in the women's organization in Iran. Deputy Minister of Education was invited to go to a conference, I don't know, somewhere in Europe. She goes to the airport, you know, and she is told that her husband has called and has told the airport authority that she does not have her permission, his permission to leave the country.
Yes.
This created such a commotion that the government decided that every woman can automatically get one signature from her husband that for the duration of the validity of that passport, she could travel as much as she wanted. So these are, I mean, it's unbelievable. It doesn't have anything to do with your position. The right of mobility is in the hand of the husband, and that's
Yes.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, if you, the system in Saudi Arabia, if you have a loving, smart, educated, tolerant husband or father, you don't even notice the system because he lets you do whatever you want. But if you have a father or a husband who's the opposite of all those things, that's when the problem comes in, and it's still a problem for many women. But Rangita would like to say something?
I wanted to respond to your question about how we can really showcase the ways in which gender equality and law reform translates into good business and good and a strong economy for women. And this also, to some extent, builds on some of the case studies that Farnaz and Halle have shared with you. And I want to share with you a case study from outside of the Muslim community, just to show that these issues resonate even outside the Muslim world. In India, the women's movement, in order to show the ways in which issues such as guardianship and heads of household translate the lack of guardianship rights, equal guardianship rights, and lack of equal rights in decision making in the household translate into bad business practices. They did what they call, they're very good at cause lawyering, using a public interest litigation initiative to showcase a problem in the law and use that to reform the law. They had Geeta Hariharan, who was the head of the central bank in India, one of the world's leading economists, to go and open a bank account for her son, her minor son, and she could not. The central bank refused to do that without the signature of her husband, because while the father is alive, the child is considered under the guardianship of the father. So this was done in a very deliberate fashion, using an iconic woman as an example, as a case study. And the Indian Supreme Court ruled that women have equal rights to guardianship and would not need the signature of the husband to open a bank account for a minor son. So this is both a strategy that can be used in other parts of the world, but also showcases the ways in which legal reform in the law, gender equality legal reform in the law, is such an imperative. And there's nothing that showcases that better than what you spoke about, Fatima, the recent World Bank report on law, business, and gender. It really shows the interlinkages.
Thank you. Do you have a question on economy? please. Could you wait for the microphone?
My name is Tazeen Hassan. I'm a legal specialist with the Gender Anchor at the World Bank. I was a lawyer on the World Development Report and also the lawyer on the MENA companion piece to the World Development Report. And so it's just a follow-up question on the Lebanese example and and the campaign for an optional regime. The thing is that, and it's a very difficult context, that where women have an option to kind of choose a particular law that gives them more kind of flexibility. The fact is that it requires a lot of bargaining power to basically choose that option. And if they were able to choose that option, it means that they're more likely to have had a husband that would have supported them in getting the loan and access in the first place. And so that is kind of, it's a very kind of difficult area. But that is one of the problems when you kind of have when you expect women to opt into a more favorable regime. Do they have the bargaining power in the first place to do that?
Okay, I'd like you to respond to that, but first I'm going to take the last question from Marina Ottaway. Okay. We'll wait for the microphone. Marina will ask your question, Isabel will comment, and then Mariam will reply to this question on bargaining power.
We have been talking a lot about the women sort of at the upper echelon of the labor force, the CEO and so on. For most women, essentially, that's not an option. Most women who are looking for a job are looking for a job in a factory, in a business, and so on. And what I was wondering is to what extent the reason why the labor participation of women is so low in Arab countries is the pattern of development that they have chosen. In other words, it's not just social prejudice, but that there aren't those entry jobs because of the pattern of industrialization, of development, and so on. And what brought it home to me was visiting a Turkish factory in one of the qualified industrial zones in Egypt, where they produce for export, essentially. And this was the labor force must have been 90% women, very few men. Typical, it was a textile factory, they were producing T-shirts for export to Europe, essentially. And they were all women. And what was striking to me was that probably 90% of the women were wearing the niqab, not the headscarf, the niqab, which is highly unusual, face cover. Highly unusual in Egypt. You don't see many women wearing the niqab. But I think what it was, talking to the people, these were women who were young women who normally would have been locked up in the house, that the families would not have allowed to work. And they were out there on the shop floor, on the factory floor, working, gaining a certain degree of independence, but the cost was having to wear the face covering while they were on the floor. But so essentially the question is really twofold. One is the pattern of development that countries have chosen that does not produce opportunities for entry-level jobs, which is where, which is what is open to most women. And the other one, the strange ways in which progress for these women takes place, that yes, they were working outside the house, but they were also wearing the veil.
Yes, and who was taking their paycheck?
That I have no way to determine. But those are all steps in the process.
Okay, I would like, Fatima, would you like to respond to her?
It's a comment.
Would you like to?
Yeah, Marina, thank you very much for the question, but I really...
By the way, this is in 2010.
Okay.
Before
No. Well, thank you for the question, but I think maybe this factory is a very special case by virtue of location, by virtue of the population of the workers. The problem with the low participation of women in the labor force is the level of education, the skills acquired in the process. If we're talking about economic empowerment of women, we have to look at the education women get, the skills that they receive in this education, and then the terms. The private sector is the lowest in employing women. the government is the highest in employing women because of the easier terms and the pension, flexible hours, so on and so forth. So really, this particular case, I will not use it to generalize in Egypt that 90% of women and wearing the niqab. I would really like to look at I cannot challenge you on it, but for me, I am a bit uncomfortable using it as an example for Egypt. To me, it sounds a bit peculiar. But we do have problems with the lower participation of women and with the quality of education women receive. I fully agree with you.
So, Miriam, would you like to respond to the question about bargaining power?
So you were saying that having an optional civil law personal status would put bargaining into question, right? So if the woman may bargain, she will end up getting this, being able to profit, to benefit, and if she's not able to bargain, she will lose it, right? That's what you were saying. Yes. Yeah. So as a matter of fact, when they first get married, when a man proposes to a woman to get married, usually they are young people, and he looks very modern and everything is very nice and so on. So if she goes and let's contract a civil wedding, he would agree. Most of the time they are leaving Lebanon to go and contract a civil wedding outside in Cyprus or wherever. So this makes this optional thing affordable only to a certain class of people who are wealthy, while the others are not. That's why by having this law that is optional, you will be giving this possibility for people who can't afford traveling to do so. Young men usually are willing. The problems comes with years. Now we have a case, for instance, in the personal status courts where a couple who was recently married 2 years ago from different religions, they got married, everything was perfect, they got a child, then the man decided, I don't want to stay in this marriage, I want another wife, and I want to divorce anyways. So he initiated divorce procedures, but the kid does not even have 2 years. Is not 2 years old. The court decided to grant custody to the father starting his 2nd year of age because the mother is from a different religious community. So not to risk the kid to be raised in a different religion. Had they have this optional law, she could have said, no, I don't want to marry you under Sharia law. I want to marry you at a civil court. And she would have been safe now.
Yeah.
So it's better to have it than to have nothing.
Now we're getting very, very close to closing, but I want to give Isabel the final opportunity to ask a quick question and then have it answered.
Actually, it's not a question, it's more just a comment on this economics issue. I really think that economics is the heart of all of this. It really is what drives it. And there is a very conservative narrative that has a lot of legs for a variety of reasons that we won't go into, we've touched upon. And that conservative narrative, Marina, this is exactly what you're talking about. It's the contradiction of that narrative with the economic reality of modern societies that ends up with women wearing the niqab, filling a factory in Egypt. And the weight of that contradiction will ultimately undo the conservative narrative. It can take a very long time. Saudi, we've mentioned a couple of times, they have a lot of money. They can afford the contradiction for a very long time, and in other countries they can't. And so that conservative narrative, because of the way it's implemented in restricting women's access at a very base level in some countries to education, but restricting access to the public sphere, it's expensive. And in the Middle East, I mean, look at Saudi. They lost the battle on women in 1962 when they made the decision to allow universal education for girls. Now, it can go on for a very long time, but ultimately, when you look at what's happening today in the region, women are making up in some countries the most dynamic entrepreneurial sector. Women in the Middle East is the only region in the world where women outnumber men in the STEM subjects and outperform men in the STEM subjects. You have now 51% of all life science graduates in the Middle East are women. There's an economic implication behind that, which you can ignore if you've got oil money for a very long time, but not indefinitely. And so ultimately, I think this question does boil down to economics. And you see it in this example that Marina gave, because those women wearing the niqab are clearly from a very conservative family, and yet they're going out, they're earning a living, and I guarantee you they're going to start asking questions at some point. So, thank you.
Isabel, thank you very much for that perceptive comment, and I would like to thank all our panelists for their comments and their presentations, and I'd like to thank Hale and Rangita for organizing this. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you for